Welcome everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I am I am choking on an oatmeal kernel. 1 second. Thank you. So welcome everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I'm very, very pleased that my good friend Martin Sieff, Rising Tide Foundation advisor, writer, historian, lecturer, comedian extraordinaire, is here today.
That's a new one.
Very last minute notice. We had a cancellation. I was like, well, who would be qualified to pull together an interesting lecture on such short notice? And I was like, well, Marty can do this. So of course he obliged. And this is something I've been waiting for. I think the first time Marty pitched this idea of Warren Harding to me was well over a year ago. And I've always wanted to hear it, but things keep on coming up. So finally we've had a chance to get a real just picture, probably for the first time ever in a comprehensive manner, of one of the most slandered, misunderstood American presidents of the 20th century, and maybe even before that, Warren Harding, who I've developed a great respect for, but his short-lived presidency is something that I don't think enough people recognize or appreciate. Some of the battles with the League of Nations, some of the battles with the racists and the other proto-imperial Pax Americanists who are like waiting in the wings to take control. But today we're going to get that and a lot more. So Marty, thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. I was first introduced to Warren Harding 40 years ago in this book. And it's very significant because it is by a liberal. It is by an English liberal and a very anti-imperialist English liberal, which needs to be understood, and also a great admirer of the American people and the American experiment, and a great opponent of the British Empire. Remarkable man who recently died. I think he was well into his 90s. The name of Paul Johnson. He started out as a Clement Attlee socialist, which would have put him on an FBI wanted list in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And he spent most of the last 30 years of his life as an impassioned supporter of Margaret Thatcher and free markets. So he had an interesting, journey in his life, in a T.S. Eliot sense of a journey, of discovering who you really were all along. And his description of Harding was a revelation to me, because I'd studied Harding at Oxford under one of the greatest modern American political historians, and I do not say that ironically. I think he's even still alive in his late 90s now, Professor William E. Luchtenberg, who was the visiting Northcliffe professor of American history at Oxford. I was very fortunate to be in the year that I was studying both industrial America up to from the Civil War to World War I, and then latterly the New Deal. Professor Luchtenberg was very balanced, but through him I had to learn the historiography, American historiography of the era, which in those days, in the 1970s, was still enormously dominated by liberals. And the contempt for Warren Harding was universal. We shall go into both what they thought the reasons were and what the reasons were in a few minutes. But the contempt was overwhelming. It was unanimously accepted that just as Woodrow Wilson was one of the greatest presidents in history and one of the greatest visionary leaders the human race had ever known, Warren Harding was a contemptible, pathetic nothing. This was accepted. Now, about 12 to 15 years later, I come to America. And there is a new political ethos in America. It is Reagan. It is no longer New Deal liberal America. It is now Ronald Reagan's conservative America. There is a new political philosophy dominating the United States, shaping the Democrats almost as much as it shapes the Republicans. And there is a new reinterpretation of history emerging. There is a new historiography emerging. And in this new era, which Johnson is a major figure in shaping initially, there are new saints and there are new sinners. But the great new saint, the patron saint of this conservative America, the forerunner for it, is not Warren Harding, according to the conventional wisdom. It is Calvin Coolidge. And that remains so to this day. Now, I've discussed some elements of Calvin Coolidge en passant, in previous lectures, and because he succeeds Harding in what he continues to do successfully, and more importantly, what he does not continue to do catastrophically, he's a very unworthy successor to Harding. But if you ask anyone in the Cato Institute in Washington or in the Heritage Foundation, either the mainstream Republican free marketeers or the Cato supposedly, they're not really anti-imperialists, but they think they are and they claim to be. And they're free trade obsessives, a lot of them, right? They're all free trade obsessives. They all revere Calvin Coolidge and they misunderstand him completely. And they all despise Warren Harding. So before we even start, I place the first of many conundrums before you, which is, how does Warren Harding manage to be simultaneously loathed and despised by every liberal intellectual in America, right? And simultaneously be despised by every true-hearted Republican free market conventional genius in America? How can that possibly be? You got to love him for that alone, right? You really got to love him for that alone. Matt, I know you have proud Canadian, English, German ancestry. You've got to have some Scots-Irish in you somewhere as well, because it is the Scots-Irish genius. And Jerry, again, you know what my punchline is. I see it in your laughter before you even do it. And so do you, Steve. And that is, you come as I do from the basalt of the Antrim Plateau in Northern Ireland, and you revel in being hated and despised by the rest of the world. You know, it's that old fool Nietzsche's cliche actually brought to real life, which he was never capable of doing. You know, whichever wounds you makes you stronger, whatever wounds you actually makes you die. But if you're hated by the right people, it can only make you stronger. It can only make you, provided you recognize it. Oh, I wish I was there to toast that with you, Stephen. Bless you. Exactly the right temperament. Is it a rosé, or do we have any details on the vintage?
It's a Ripasso.
Ah, impeccable taste as always. What can I say? So, first of all, what was Warren Harding's great original sin? It's very important, because it's more relevant today than to ever. I often find in life in general, but especially with these seminars with you guys, that there is what the mystics would call a kind of, a divine convergence, what Arthur Koestler calls synchronicity. In the Kabbalistic mystical Jewish tradition, it's called being beshert. Einstein has a word for it, his conception of gravity. He couldn't explain gravity, but he says gravity brings everything to where it's supposed to go in the first place, which is typical of Einstein. Einstein is a great poet. He's a lovely human being. He's the greatest of philosophers, a terrible physicist, and couldn't even add up math. On one occasion, the editor of the New York Times, the great Carl Vanander, corrected one of Einstein's equations that he got wrong. And Einstein, who was a graceful human being, acknowledged it. But what's the synchronicity here? We are celebrating, folks, and Stephen's wine is a perfect introduction, but there's always a glass afterwards to it. The 100th anniversary of the death of, you could argue, the martyrdom of Warren Harding. He died I think it was August 5th, but it was earlier than our date today, but it was in August 1923. And I guarantee you there will be no celebrations anywhere across the United States, except possibly something much smaller than, more modest than our own small but deeply felt gathering, an elite gathering here. There will be outside his home place in Ohio. There will be no celebrations of this anywhere in the United States. It's as if you were talking about Ted Bundy or Stalin or Adolf Hitler. And yet, as we shall see, he was one of the very greatest American presidents. But why is he relevant for today? Because he brought the United States back from the brink of physical disintegration and civil war, where there had been a complete collapse of confidence in the political elite, where there had been a complete breakdown of law and order and due process on a national level. where habeas corpus had collapsed and become a joke to a degree far worse than ever happened during the overhyped McCarthy quote-unquote terror. It wasn't really, in the 1950s. The economy was on the brink of bankruptcy. The economy was collapsing at a faster and more dangerous rate than it ever did between 1929 and 1933 at the height of the Great Depression, when he took office. American soldiers were occupying more than half of Russia. We had invaded Russia and nobody noticed. We had occupied all of Siberia and nobody noticed. There are also plans widely afoot from the previous president, Woodrow Wilson, to create an American militarily imposed empire on the Middle East and to keep the entire nation of Turkey down by military force. Rather like using Ukraine today to occupy Russia, wouldn't you say? It was insane. We had a president in the White House who was almost as arguably as incompetent as the president today is. He was not yet 70. We now have, for the first time in our history, a supposedly 80-year-old president. We have, incidentally, a political system so gaga that we have a United States Senator, Dianne Feinstein from California, whose own daughter, quite correctly, has taken out legal authority to act on her behalf to pay the rent of her house and keep her electrical and water utilities running. And she is still rolled out for every vote of the Senate, even though her assistants have to basically guide her hand to press the right button. I mean, this is another proof to me of the superiority of Buddhism and Buddhist theology and medicine, because Buddhist monks mummify themselves while still alive. And the proof that this can happen is just take one look of one video of Dianne Feinstein. This is our situation today. 104 years ago, it was even worse. At the end of World War I, with 10 million people dead, with the highest death toll from the greatest natural disaster in the history of the United States of America, and one of the highest in all history in the Western Hemisphere, which was the great misnamed Spanish flu pandemic. It wasn't from Spain and it wasn't the flu, but it was a pandemic that swept the world. And it killed 500,000 people in America alone in the space of a year, and there was no cure for it. And at the same time, all this is happening, there are the worst race riots in American history, the most violent ones, from city to city across the United States. And then the economy collapses in 1920. And as I say, it collapses at a faster rate of implosion than occurred in the worst days of the Great Depression of 1929, 1930. And the institution that has been set up only 5 years before by Woodrow Wilson to expressly prevent such a disaster ever happening again, and which is celebrated to this day as Woodrow Wilson's another of his great phantom achievements, was the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And of course, it only makes things worse. It helps cause the implosion and then accelerates it. And then a new president comes in. And in the space of 6 months, his first 6 months in office, what does this new president do? He ends the greatest economic crisis in the history of the United States and in the history of North America. And he does so without recourse to any of Keynes's nostrums whatsoever. Keynes hasn't even written his general theory down yet. This new president does so without spending any extra money whatsoever. He does so without raising taxes. Ultimately, he slashes taxes. He imposes genuine fiscal discipline on the United States government for the first time in its entire history. He restructures the United States government, in fact. He brings world peace. He does so not by joining the League of Nations, but by refusing to join it, because he sees how it is, as designed, a pathetic, powerless joke. And if it was given power, it would be even more dangerous and destructive. He sees all this clearly. He takes the bulk of the United States Army out from where it is, which is where it should never have been in the first place, in Russia, occupying Siberia, occupying the Trans-Siberian Railroad with two very improbable allies. Two-thirds of Russia, all of Asian Russia and Siberia, is effectively run and controlled for a year and a half after the revolution, thanks to Woodrow Wilson, by elements of the United States Army, Imperial Japan, and the new Czech Republic, a force which had previously actually been fighting as volunteers with the Habsburg Empire, and which found themselves, through their own ineptitude, strewed out all across Siberia. One thing in passant you have to understand about the Czechs, not the Slovaks, who are extraordinarily brave people and have a magnificent military record. Czechs are a prosperous, high-tech, well-educated nation with the most advanced industry, especially military industry, in Central and Eastern Europe. And none of them ever wants to fight a war. And they never raise a finger in their own defense, and they always blame other people for not spending their blood to rescue them. This happened in 1918, it happened in 1938, it happened in 1948, and it happened in 1968. To paraphrase a quote from Winston Churchill about a particularly inept British admiral who threw away victory 3 times in one battle in World War I, John Jellicoe at the Battle of Jutland. Throw away a chance of victory 3 times, and Churchill writes, Churchill's a terrible war leader, but he's a great wit. He comes out with great lines to excuse his incompetence every time, right? 3 times is a lot. Well, in the history of the Czech Republic and Czech people, 4 times is a lot, right? 4 times is a lot. You don't raise a finger to fight for your own independence in 1918. You don't raise a finger, actually, in 1920 to fight to save Europe from a communist revolution. The Poles do that dirty work for you at the Battle of the Vistula. You don't raise a finger in your own defense in 1938. Again, the Polish people fought a desperate, gallant, tragic, losing battle twice against the 2 worst tyrants in modern history. First against Hitler in 1939, then again against Hitler when Stalin left them in the lurch in 1944 in the Battle of Warsaw. And in 1968, what is the I joked when I came to the Washington Times that one of my greatest scoops was discovering the secret plan of the Czech Ministry of Defense in case they were invaded again by the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Everybody watching me on the screen closely, I'm going to demonstrate without a word what the Czech defense plan would have been if the Warsaw Pact had invaded them again in the 1980s. I surrender. I use 2 words. They never fight, ever. They're armorers. They produce wonderful weapon systems. They produced 22,000 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The bulk of the Luftwaffe's frontline force was not produced in German factories. It was produced at the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia, Western Czechoslovakia, by Czech armorers who were paid very well and lived very comfortably through all of World War II. That is why Warsaw was a devastated hellhole, and so were Vienna and Budapest after they'd been fought over repeatedly in World War II. But Prague is still a fabulous city. It's the jewel of Eastern Europe. I love going there every time myself. But because it's never been fought over, they never defended it, surrendered every time. Surrendered every time. Maybe it's the best place to wait out World War III. That's their track record so far, at least. But in 1921, Warren Harding inherits a Russia that is occupied by the United States Army, without approval of Congress, of course, and by the Imperial Japanese Empire, and of all things, by the army of the new Czech Republic, which just finds itself there. And because its diplomats at Versailles are very skillful diplomats, and they're very good at getting the British Empire, the French Empire, and the United States government to pay their bills. And that's why it's there. But American foreign policy is a mess. The United States is collapsing. And where is the President of the United States? Where is Woodrow Wilson? They cannot even wheel him out like Dianne Feinstein or President Biden. The President of the United States is in his bedroom, incapacitated by a stroke that has literally paralyzed one of his sides. He continues on not quite as a vegetable, but as a total invalid and a physically helpless human being who has to have his diapers changed several times a day for the next 5 years till he dies in his house in Hughes Street in Washington. He never goes back to New Jersey, where he didn't really ever sit or belong anyway. He lives the rest of his life in Washington, or what's left of his life. But he is president of the United States for 18 months. The vice president, Thomas Marshall, is an nonentity and a moron who is terrified of the responsibilities of the presidency and doesn't want it. So the United States is ruled by Woodrow Wilson's second wife, Edith Marshall, who is actually almost a functional illiterate. She can hardly sign her own name. And that is where all the decisions which are followed by the cabinet and by a fearful Democratic Party are taken for 18 months, or rather not taken. And this is the condition that the new president of the United States inherits in 1921. What was the background of this president of the United States who faced the gravest crisis in American history? Once again, it confounds all the elitist, pompous, upper-class lies. And remember, this is someone with 10 years of higher education, 2 degrees from the University of Oxford, and 3 years of postgraduate studies at the London School of Economics, as well as having published already to this point either 7 or 9, it depends how you define them, books so far. What is the educational and professional background of the new president of the United States? He has never been to Yale. He has never been to Harvard. Well, that was true of George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Abraham Lincoln as well, and it didn't hold them back, did it? Or Ronald Reagan. He's never been to any of, or Harry Truman. He had never been to any of those places. He is not from the East Coast. He is not an elitist. He is, however, from the state of Ohio. He is the 7th out of 10 Ohio presidents, and the last, unfortunately, to be elected as president or become president of the United States in little more than less than 60-year period from 1865 to 1921 to 23. The first of them was arguably the greatest of them all, and one of the, as I've said, another of the most underestimated presidents in American history, an extraordinary human being, Ulysses S. Grant. But Grant had been through West Point, and Grant, of course, had been a veteran of 2 long, major, ferocious wars. The War of Aggression against Mexico from 1845 to 1848, and he had commanded in the greatest war which to this day has ever been fought in the Western Hemisphere, the Union forces in the Civil War. And Grant was, by the time he became president, was already an enormously experienced military commander with immense experience over the previous decade at the highest level of political military interaction and diplomacy and politics as well. And now we have a president who is none of those things. There is one figure who said about, apropos of Harry Truman, and I assure Martin not being an admirer of Harry Truman, but there's a great phrase, and it applies more strongly to Harding, and it is this, that in every small town in the United States with a population of 10 or 20,000 or under, there is at least one individual human being who is capable of serving as president of the United States. Now, when this quote is hauled out by Merle Miller in a hugely entertaining and enormously influential and utterly fictitious and factually worthless book, Plain Speaking, extolling the joys of Harry Truman. It's all lies. Truman told Merle Miller all these stories when he was drunk in a CBS green room before they taped their interviews together, which were rightly deemed to be too outrageous and ridiculous ever to be shown on national television. I mean, they're not hidden. They're now there in the Truman Archive, and they're accessible to the public. But Miller, after Truman was safely dead, basically stole the material and recycled it as a loving, admiring biography of Truman. And it's full of incidents where Truman is absolutely fearless, brilliant, puts the Russians in their place, puts Eisenhower in his place. The only problem is, of course, the incidents never happened. He made them up, and Merle Miller never questioned them. But that's where this quote comes from. But it applies to Warren Harding, because in Marion, Ohio, there was born and raised a man who was quiet, decent, kind, and obscure, mildly successful in his own life, but nothing to write home about until he was more than 50 years of age, and even then nobody paid any attention to him. And he brought peace and prosperity to the world, and he restored the democracy of the United States for another century. Although, of course, for the last half of that century, it has been systematically undermined on a massive scale, yet at the very minimum, yet again. He has a local background. He comes from a very poor personal background that is impoverished. He marries shrewdly, with his head, though not with his heart, a woman a number of years older than him, who is very ambitious, focused, driving, and dynamic, where he appears to be rather too much easygoing, though that is yet another lying cliche about him. He is a kind of easygoing person, but he is also successful in every business and political endeavor up to the highest level of grand strategy that he ever, as we shall see, that he turns his mind to. He becomes a local businessman, a newspaper man. He gets enough money together to buy out one of the most unimportant local regional papers in the state of Ohio, in his own hometown. And he never makes a big empire of it. He's not out for wealth, he's not out for power. But it's enough to ensure a respectable middle-class prosperity for him and a comfortable home for him. His wife is too old to have kids, which is a heart-long heartbreak for him because he's a kind man, and in the best sense, he loves children and he loves to see them play. Though here too we will find an improbable happy end to this part of the story as well. And eventually he goes into local politics in the state of Ohio. And eventually, because he's likable, competent, pays his bills, there is not a hint of scandal about him, and he shares the politically decent, moderate, small c conservative views of those around him, he is eventually nominated for a seat in the United States Senate. He is seen as a safe man in the Republican Party. And he enters the United States Senate. He's elected in the Republican year in 1914. There's a Democratic president. And again, as often happens with such people, liked, respected, not even taken seriously, not despised, but neither taken particularly seriously in his own party. Remember, the party is still dominated by the man of genius and the man of vision, Theodore Roosevelt and his friends, who love the British Empire and who believe manifest destiny is not, as John O'Sullivan, the editor of the 1840s, wrote it, a mandate for America to settle the great heartland of America and build a new civilization in America, especially using the new technology of railroads. Does that sound familiar to any of us here? No. The manifest destiny has been hijacked, just as terms like democracy and free markets have more recently been hijacked by similar people, right? And it is now used as an excuse for white, racist, imperial domination and looting of the rest of the globe in partnership with the British Empire based in London. This is Theodore Roosevelt's vision of genius, right? Except there are many, of course, there are many problems with it. Not the least of it is that by 1920, the American people are sick and tired of both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson's visions of genius. It has brought them 200,000 dead young boys for no reason whatsoever in World War I. It has wrought a world with less democracy, freedom, stability, prosperity, and happiness by far in it by 1920 than it enjoyed in 1911, 1912, when, thanks to the powers of the business powers and imperialism of New York and London and Washington, there wasn't that much to be had in either the Western Hemisphere or Asia or Africa in any case. But things have become vastly worse. The great ancient stable empires of the Ottoman Turks, of the Russian Romanovs, of the imperial Habsburgs in Central Europe, and as we now know, of course, most ominously of all, who eventually replaced big bad Kaiser Wilhelm II, a buffoon and a dangerous idiot, but not in the deepest sense a malevolent or wicked man. But of course, he was eventually succeeded within 15 years by somebody who was all of those dark things. So American involvement in World War I and the great Woodrow Wilson solution in World War I. Remember his magic stick, one-word solution. I mean, from the Midwest in America, I had a friend who died about 18 years ago. His columns are still well worth rereading in book form. The late Richard Grenier, an outrageous conservative columnist for the Washington Times and for Commentary magazine, of all things before that. He eventually got himself fired by both, which is an interesting achievement in itself. And there are actually good as well as bad reasons for that. I knew Richard very well. We were good friends, and I loved him. But he had his tangents. But he was a genius and a brilliant guy. And one of his great insights, and to this day I cannot stop laughing uncontrollably at it. We've all heard the term the hot zone. That supposedly the most poisonous, deadly diseases in the world don't come out of laboratories in the United States or in China or anywhere else for that matter, or CIA laboratories. No, of course, that never happens. They all come out of Central Africa spontaneously, right? So Central Africa gets conveniently called the hot zone. Well, yeah, my friend, who incidentally was Canadian by birth, he was the offspring of a dynasty of Canadian lumberjacks, the Greniers on his father's side from Quebec, and on his mother's side from New York Jewish intellectuals. And needless to say, this made a critical mixture, a very entertaining and powerful critical mixture, right? He said there is another hot zone in the world. The hot zone of ridiculous, ludicrous, incredibly dangerous, crackpot political and philosophical ideas. And that's across the heartland of the United States of America. He says the America is the hot zone for crazy ideas. And one of them is passion for the League of Nations. Another, incidentally, you could say is Esperanto. Another is the progressive movement in general. Another is the idea that the Federal Reserve is going to magically end all depressions in American history. Instead, it immediately causes the two worst depressions in American history, the Depression of 1920 and the Depression of 1929, 1932. Can both, the second one is not solely caused remotely by the Fed, but it sure as heck doesn't help. To put it mildly, it really doesn't help. All of the above, right? Now, here is this man who is a senator from Ohio, an obscure senator, no higher education, a relatively simple man, simple in his pleasures. He likes younger ladies, as who married to Florence Harding would not, right? He likes a good cigar. He likes a good shot of bourbon. He does not go for underage boys or girls under the age of content. He doesn't go for boys at all, as a matter of fact. He has other things against him. He's in favor of full civil rights for Black Americans. He opposes segregation as being disgusting to the human race. This automatically makes him worse than the communist to the Democratic Party of the day in Congress, which is simultaneously impeccably liberal, pro-big government, and in favor of maintaining Jim Crow segregation, and as we shall see, institutions vastly worse south of the Mason-Dixon line. But it's 1920, and the great god Theodore Roosevelt is dead. He burns himself out, dies at the age of 59 with a body that is that of somebody in his early 80s in decrepitude. And in Roosevelt's case, he's very much of a prude and a simplistic fellow. What he would have called a quote-unquote clean liver, really a simplistic twit. But he has burned his body out by running around the hot zone of physical diseases. If you run in your 50s, if you run around endlessly swigging bourbon around the jungles of the Amazon and Central Africa for years on end, you are going to get some unpleasant conditions. Also, he is giving a speech in 1912 when a would-be assassin shoots him in the chest. He insists on finishing his speech, which, being Theodore Roosevelt, is a meaningless, long-winded, long speech for another 55 minutes. Nobody remembers a word in the speech, but he insists on speaking for 55 more minutes after he has a bullet in the chest. And he is astonished to discover he does not make a quick or full recovery from his wound for the rest of his life. Even in those days, they could have done a better job with triaging him had he let them do it. had he let them do it. But by 1919, he is dead, and Woodrow Wilson is a cripple who cannot even express two consistent syllables out of his mouth because of his stroke. And the American people has lost 200,000 dead boys in World War One, and their cities are exploding in racial riots, and 500,000 of them have just died in the most catastrophic health pandemic to sweep the world in the 20th century in more than 100 years. So understandably, the American people, for some strange reason, are now sick and tired of endless speechifying. There is no radio yet. There is no television yet. So having politicians speak for 3 or 4 hours at a time is basically what you do when you can't watch Friends or Seinfeld for a few hours on TV every night. Aren't you glad you live in the 21st century? Right? Aren't you glad you live in the 21st century? Even in the 1960s, we had Star Trek. One can see why a generation was even so desperate to watch I Love Lucy if the alternative was listening to Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt for 4 hours at a time, 2 or 3 times a year, and that was the height of your cultural year. Technology changes culture, and culture changes the way we think. And Woodrow Wilson, finally, after my usual long, endless wind-up, we get back to the man in question. Warren Harding understands this. Because no, Warren Harding did not have any degrees from Oxford or Cambridge, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, or from Cambridge in England, Cambridgeshire. He was not from New York City. He had not been Columbia University. He had not debated naval strategy with Admiral Mahan, or written books on naval strategy like Theodore Roosevelt as excuses to justify enslaving the world. He hadn't written any books, but he was a small-scale local Marion, Ohio businessman who knew how to balance his books and pay a decent living wage to his staff and treat them with respect. And he knew what his audiences wanted, and he had become a successful newspaper publisher and had expanded modestly to a small, and notice he isn't even an empire builder psychologically then. He expands like any successful businessman, but he is not obsessed with being a Pulitzer or a Hearst. He is not obsessed with going coast to coast. He is not obsessed like Rupert Murdoch with telling the entire world what to think. He is not obsessed with owning every retail outlet in America like Jeff Bezos and Amazon. He expands modestly, and he knows when to stop and to continue to live comfortably. And he brings this know-how with him into the United States Senate. And nobody thinks of him as a president, but he's liked, he's respected. And when Theodore Roosevelt dies, Roosevelt has sucked all the oxygen out of the Republican Party. There are no credible candidates around. So they just want a safe bet, somebody who won't divide the party and hopefully won't mess everything up too much. And that's how Warren Harding gets the job of being presidential candidate. And he's up against the A-team because in his first bat at national office at the age of 51, right? No national political experience outside the state of Ohio. He is in a national presidential election against Franklin Roosevelt. Because it's 1920, and James Cox is also from Ohio, and a much more eminent Ohio politician. He's been governor. And who is his running mate? Another Roosevelt. And as it turns out, the greatest political brain of the 20th century in American history. FDR himself, not yet crippled by polio, in his early 40s, handsome, dynamic, filled with energy, filled with intelligence, and they get creamed. Old, easygoing, lazy Warren Harding beats them with every trick that isn't in the book. Do I mean a dirty election? No, not at all. It's a completely clean, fair election. But how do we visualize, ever since that idiot wrote the hagiographical book about JFK in 1960, Theodore something or other, remember the birth of a president or the creation of a president. He'd be an eminent Time magazine, news magazine political hack. And he writes this book, and the whole theme changes the way we look at election campaigns. Because it says the way to win a presidential election, which is sometimes the case before, but not by no means always the case, is to be young, to be dynamic, to be vigorous, to be a great speaker, to raise people with rhetoric to their highest dreams. What does America require of you? Do not ask what you require of America. This is the way Teddy Roosevelt talked. It is the way Woodrow Wilson talked. We are going to make this, we are entering this war not to win this war, but to make it a war to end all wars. And to prove this, we are going to create our League of Nations. And the American people will never know the terrors of economic recession or depression again, because we have created a Federal Reserve Board. And we have completed a free and fair income tax for you to pay, so nobody will have too heavy burdens to pay. And we are going to create a humane, kind, just internal revenue service, an IRS. Isn't that going to be wonderful? Isn't that going to be wonderful? Yes. Yes, dear, I am. I can tell the world what to think, but not my family. But that's usual in the world. Teddy Roosevelt had the same problem with his daughter Alice. But here we are. We have a new president who has concepts which sound ridiculous. And even worse, how does he campaign in 1920? He's up against Franklin Roosevelt. And what does he do? Roosevelt and Cox cross the United States. They run an energetic campaign. Warren Harding stays at home in Marion, Ohio, but people come to see him. Who comes to see him? Newspaper editors and photographers come to see him. The earliest newsreel photographers come to see him. Murray Pickford comes to see him. So does Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the action hero of Hollywood in the day. So does Charlie Chaplin. He and his team organize this. He understands the power of Hollywood. He understands the power of celebrity. He understands the power of celebrity. He understands, he is a newspaper man. He runs small newspapers, but his newspapers are small in a way thousands of newspapers across the United States are small. He sees how the Associated Press and other wire agencies and United Press communicate photographs and images and stories and headlines and ideas that he runs in his newspaper, that his handful of readers read, and he knows this is replicated 1,000, 10,000 times over across the United States. So he understands communication to the American people across America, not just in the East Coast and the West Coast elites, but within the states of heartland America in a way that no previous president has ever done before. This is revolutionary. And because he's a kind, slow-moving, easy-going gentleman, nobody realizes the revolutionary effectiveness of this apparently lazy, apparently slow, apparently self-indulgent campaign. 60 years later, the Democratic Party political strategists, supposedly the finest and best of the nation, catastrophically underestimate Ronald Reagan the same way. And of course, Reagan has a background in communications. He's been a movie star. He's the only president ever to have been a trade union leader in American history, because he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and very successfully so on behalf of his members for many years. But most of all, he'd been a radio show host and a baseball commentator on radio in the 1930s back in his native Iowa. In other words, he came from grassroots. Both of them, they came from the grassroots. They never forgot their grassroots. They understood their grassroots. And next we shall also find, as was said very interestingly of Eisenhower and other presidents and other leaders around the world, there are people who everybody thinks will make the greatest ever president, the greatest ever war prime minister, the greatest ever general of the armies, until they actually get there. The Romans, who had a great empire of their own and who had skeptical historians and intellectuals who understood power and the using and misusing of power, understood this 2,000 years ago. The great historian Tacitus says of the Emperor Galba, I think it was, a Roman senator in 68 who became Emperor of Rome by public acclamation and was forced to commit suicide less than half a year later because he didn't have a clue what to do, and the empire fell apart on his watch. Capable of ruling, he was judged capable of ruling if only he had never ruled. He looked the part perfectly until he actually had to, he talked the talk, but he couldn't walk the walk. And once he had to walk the walk, it all fell apart. General McClellan was George McClellan was that way, of course, during the Civil War. And then, as I've said in previous lectures, you had Ulysses Grant, or a figure we should look at, I would pitch to you, Matt, for a future subject, and that is the man who broke the British class system in the 1940s, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who Churchill hated and kept out of the highest power for 2.5 years and never understood, who saved Churchill, who saved the British, who arguably saved the Americans more than once as well, never got any credit for it because he never looked or acted like a general. But he could do the job. And this, it turned out, was the case with, but in the case of Ulysses Grant or Montgomery, you look at men who, beneath their shy, quiet, or pain in the neck exterior, were always studying, seriously engaged, were really mentally preparing themselves professionally for the highest level long before they ever got there. This is true in Harding's case philosophically and practically, but not consciously. When he became president of the United States in 1921, as I say, he had only been in the Senate for 6 years. He had never served in the House. He had never been a state governor, which is the usual route to developing executive experience in the American political system before you become president. And it usually works well. Worked for Reagan, worked wonderfully well for Franklin Roosevelt, worked well for Bill Clinton. But this was not Harding's route. But when he became president, all the experience he has had as a local businessman, as a local politician, and arguably most of all as a local communicator, running small local newspapers that had to be responsive to the needs and conceptualities of his readership. He couldn't make things too impressive. After television came in, after national syndicated media came in, even with columns in the 1930s and 1940s, the more to this day, the more you sound dignified, thoughtful, profound. If I could put on this act, which of course I cannot, then I might well be on PBS today, giving you my serious, dignified thoughts, which of course wouldn't be worth fucking shit. Right? And that's what you pay for anyway. But Harding did not come from that kind of background. He came from the grassroots. He applied common sense, but did that mean he hated elitists? He was always against them? He sneered at them? No. Harding was of the best American tradition in that he recognized talent, and quality. And when he staffed his cabinet, he made it one of the most talented cabinets in American history. Another of the lies about Harding. He only put crooks and mediocrities in the federal government, in his cabinet. Sure. His Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, had already been a Supreme Court Justice of the United States and the most successful liberal, in the best sense of the word, reforming governor in the history of New York State. After he served as Harding's Secretary of State, he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. He became a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he was so successful as Supreme Justice of the United Supreme Court that he single-handedly outwitted President Franklin Roosevelt to block Roosevelt's 1937 court-backing plan and end the reform era of the New Deal. You know, even though FDR served for another 8 years as president, Hughes outwitted him and blocked him. But as Secretary of State, Hughes and Harding did something that was so enormous that nobody in a third of a millennium had been able to do it. On global history, they destroyed the global power of the British Empire. Because in 1921, in the first year of Harding's presidency, There was an expensive naval shipbuilding race developing between Britain and the United States. It was like hypersonic glide missiles today or intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in the 1950s and 1960s. It was seen, rightly or wrongly, as the future to dominating the world and world power, or even as the future for national survival for the next 100 years. What language is the world going to speak in the next 100 years? Well, actually, that didn't matter because both the British and the Americans spoke English, so it would be English in any case. But who would run the world? Would it be us or would it be them? And remember, they had run the world for 300 years and more already since the days of the Spanish Armada. And through World War I, the British Navy was still incomparably, even after the great expansion of the United States Navy, which was masterminded not by President Woodrow Wilson, but by the effective political head of the Navy at the time, who was, do I have any takers? You've heard of him before, all of you have. Another clue, you like him, so do I.
FDR.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Oh, in theory, only Assistant Secretary of State of the Navy, but there was no Pentagon, there was no Department of Defense, there was no Department of Defense bureaucracy. The Secretary of the Navy was his own boss, and at that time it was Josephus Daniels for 8 years, a shrewd political operator, but lazy, indulgent, loved his bourbon, greased the wheels in Congress to get the funding through, trusted friend and buddy of Wilson's, otherwise had no interest in the Navy whatsoever. So who gave the naval contracts? Who approved the designs of the new submarines and battleships and pioneering naval air technology? Why, the number 2 man at the Navy, of course, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the architect of America's true global naval power, and who ran for the vice presidential spot in the 1920 ticket and who was whipped by Warren Harding by record levels. Harding won the 1920 presidential election by a landslide level that had never before seen in American history and would only ever again be exceeded by FDR himself in 1936. It was a whirlwind. It was a repudiation of Wilson. It was a repudiation of everything. But it was not run on nothing. He had a very distinct policy, platform, and he summed it all up in one word: normalcy. Now, because normalcy is not an East Coast intellectual word, and because it is not approved of and has never been used by East Coast intellectuals, it is sneered at as being a meaningless word. But in fact, Harding defined it in speech after speech, and it could not have been a more clearly defined policy. Normalcy meant going back to the political philosophy, economics, international security conceptions of the president he most revered and admired, which was the president who had been assassinated in 1901 to clear the way for Theodore Roosevelt, President William McKinley. Even the way McKinley ran for president in 1896 and 1900 was directly copied from him by Harding, a very close student of politics and history in his own lifetime. He went for, all his life, he'd gone for Sunday morning rides on his horse around the neighborhood. So had McKinley, even as president. In the White House, he continued that tradition. During the 1896 campaign, when William Jennings Bryan was running around America with an energy never before seen by any candidate in American history, he was frightening the propertied and middle classes as much as he was stirring up the farm workers across America, and he was frightening industrial workers too. So McKinley had the brilliant policy with Senator Mark Hanna, his political manager and strategist, of doing a stay-at-home campaign. Staying at home, serious man, reassuring, placid, comfortable, teaching, the country is going to be in safe hands with me. None of these dangerous revolutionaries taking over. We all had a civil war in our lifetime. We saw what it cost in human suffering and death. None of us wants to go through that again. In 1920, Warren Harding very shrewdly understands that the yearning for normalcy is a yearning not for a word, not to go back to a childhood dream, but to go back to a state of stability and security and prosperity that had been lost in the whirlwind chase after mad utopias throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century that had been embodied by three men. Uh, uh, William Jennings Bryan himself, the last of them to die in 1925, but most of all by those two horribly destructive and futile presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. So he becomes president in 1920, and he takes the oath of office in January 21. Now, again, according to all the conventional wisdom, the dark era of American history is about to begin. There's an era of crime and corruption. I got an email, which Matt also was copied on overnight by a fellow who I have clashed with on radio shows, sneering at me. Oh, in what world was your Harding great president, right? A parallel universe, surely. Ha, ha, ha. This guy was not a liberal. This was an arch reactionary who reveres Hitler and who on a radio show with me, publicly accused President Franklin Roosevelt of deliberately starving 2 million Americans to death on an internationally broadcast radio show. I told him on the spot he was speaking a crock of shit, and I would be happy to appear with him anytime. But anytime I appeared with him, I would, and he came out, if he spoke serious stuff, I would respect it. But if he came out with obscene, absurd, lying shit like that, I would nail him in his place, as I fucking well did. You see, another reason why they'll never have me again on PBS. Wow. Now, in 1921, Harding becomes president. The rate of collapse in the New York Stock Exchange is sinking at a faster level than ever happened at the worst times of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. The index gap between the highest point that the Dow Jones had reached before the 1920 collapse and the lowest point, 1919, the collapse started in 19 under Wilson, obviously, but the lowest point it reached in 1920, there was a greater gap than at the greatest depth of the Great Depression from the greatest high of the 1920s boom. That is how far and how fast and how dangerous the economic system of the United States was collapsing. At the same time, due process of law, the entire great legal system of America that had started in the colonies and had slowly and painstakingly evolved over almost over 300 years since 1612 and 1621 had literally collapsed. Under Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, Tom Palmer, under the Palmer raids, people were being raided, hauled out of their homes, thrown into federal penitentiaries, beaten to a pulp, effectively tortured, held without trial, held without habeas corpus, held without due process or trial by jury for indefinite periods of time. The Bureau of Investigation, which had been set up in 1908, an early precursor of national political control, was running out of control. Congress was too scared and too supportive to rein it in. Wilson approved of such measures anyway. That's what happens when you get an out-of-control experienced academic, and he'd been a university president to high acclaim in New Jersey before he became president. Very dangerous to make such people political chief executives or even governors, because they'll run your state or they'll run your nation the way they ran their university and college, which is, if they can get away with it, with absolute power and mercilessness if they get the chance. That they don't have the restraints that having to spend a lifetime working on compromises in local and state and federal legislatures automatically impose on people. It's a completely different set of thinking. And this was Woodrow Wilson. So what does Warren Harding do? He reins in the Bureau of Investigation. He puts new, more restrained leaders in front of it. He puts his own trusted campaign manager in as Attorney General. And this eventually turns out actually to be a disastrous move for the poor president personally, as we shall see. Because although in general he is a superb judge of men and a superb judge of lieutenants and executives and managers, nobody's always perfect. I've been an executive and theoretically a chief executive of a company. The company I was in, for the record, was extremely small, but even there, I experienced people being nice to me and saying what a genius I was only because I could give them jobs or give them contracts. And when people turn on the charm, or when they have the right resumes, or even if they've been friends of you before, but you've only known them in different positions, you cannot predict how they will perform in executive positions if you give them even the tiniest amount of power and responsibility or budgets. Ultimately, you can never, it's why playing poker and bridge are such wonderful preparations for life, and why chess is such a terrible preparation for life, because you have to factor the uncertainty factor of what you do not know into every decision you ever make. And you have to be ready to recognize when you make mistakes, because we all do, and then you have to be able to act quickly to rectify those mistakes once they become clear. And Warren Harding, as a newspaper man and as a man who, from his business background, had even sat on local banks, not big banks that were too big to fail and therefore could get away with any irresponsible monstrosity imaginable, but small, local, grassroots banks that had to be able to, that knew their neighbors, that had to be able to judge whether somebody was worth a safe bet to invest in and get your money back from and get investment back from, or whether you were throwing your good money after bad, and when to know how to cut this. And because of this background, Warren Harding also sets up something the United States government has never had before: the Bureau of the Budget. For the first time, all the finances and budgeting of all the different departments of the federal government have to be coordinated, cannot just be falsified and you get away with it, or hope the Congress will overlook it. The department, federal secretaries can no longer cut their private sweet deals with the chairs of congressional committees, as had happened throughout American history before, and bankrupt the rest of the government or starve it of resources. No, everything had to come for the first time. Excuse me a moment. Quiet, 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 please. There you are. I am also, again, navigating different worlds simultaneously. Bureau of the Budget, we take it for granted. Every respectable government, every credible government in the world has one. The United States did not have it until 1920. That is why one key reason Britain became a world power. They had more to spend on bribing and toppling other governments. They had more to spend on building navies and armies to conquer the world, because they kept their spending focused and prioritized in a central federal system from the time of Queen Elizabeth I and Oliver Cromwell all the way through into modern times and today. And we did not have that until Warren Harding imposed ficto discipline, financial discipline, on the federal government of the United States. Never gets any credit for it. He did a lot more than that. He was the first president since Ulysses S. Grant, the first president in 50 years to act to protect the very lives and civil rights of Black Americans, especially south of the Mason-Dixon line. He pushed repeatedly until he died, and it was never passed into law because he died before he could be triumphantly re-elected with a burn-proof Republican majority, which would certainly have happened in 1924, because, as I say, he was the most popular president in American history since Lincoln died. Lincoln wasn't that popular when he was alive. But Warren Harding was more popular when he was alive than Abraham Lincoln was when he was alive. And he pushed repeatedly in speech after speech his commitment to a new anti-lynching law that would make lynching a federal crime, which the full resources of the United States Army and federal institutions of law enforcement could be used to fight against. Now, at this time, the 80-year-long terror, excuse me, there's other terrors here. There we are. Hopefully, no more dog training in the background for the next couple of hours, but then again, you never know. Now, anti-lynching. What was lynching? Lynching, we are told today, very unpleasant, very unfortunate. Maybe once every 30 or 40 years there is a crime where outrageous America. No. On balance, on average, statistically, every week, at least once per week, for 80 years, from the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877 to the Eisenhower administration in the mid-1950s, when it belatedly, but at least better late than never, Truman never did, Roosevelt never did, but Eisenhower does eventually start moving in an effectual way on this. But of course, it isn't really stamped out until LBJ brings in admirable federal legislation in the mid-1960s. Until then, so we're really talking about 90 years, not even 80 years, on average, once a week, at least one innocent Black person is falsely accused of a murder or rape or other outrageous crime, like drinking coffee at a whites-only counter across the South, and is then tortured. Eventually, his sexual organs are removed while he is still alive, and then he is hanged and burned while still alive. There is a ritual to these things that is repeatedly and almost always following. It is monstrous. And Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson do not raise a finger of objection to any of it. To any of it. The only president in 80 years to speak out publicly against this obscene stain on American civilization is Warren Harding. And because he speaks out against it, a new lie is spread about President Harding, that he must be partially Black himself. Can you think of anything more horrific or monstrous in the world? Worse than being a communist, worse than being a Nazi, or a mafioso, or a child molester? He's half Black himself. And what's the argument for this? Is there any evidence for it, either now genetically or then in terms of any documented history? No, of course not, none. He's from Ohio. There weren't many Black people in Ohio in his time, especially when he was growing up and before he was born. No, the theory is this. Why else would he cur? Why else would he cur? Now, Ulysses Grant had curred, but they were scared of President Grant. Nobody ever tried that kind of gain against him, but they tried it against President Harding, even while he was still alive. But now we come back to something else Harding did, which, as again I say, is arguably the most central issue of his entire administration. He destroys the British Empire and the historical basis of the British Empire that has existed for well over 300, if you go back to the Spanish Armada, 330 years. In 1921, he and the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, the same guy who will later stand up to Franklin Roosevelt on the court backing plan. Right. Remember, this is the man who only appoints non-entities to his cabinet. And here he's appointed a former Supreme Court justice who is about to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And they convene the Washington Naval Conference of 1921. And they hold it in Washington. And because America is holding Britain's debts, the British have to come. And America imposes certain terms on Britain. You are not to renew your alliance with Imperial Japan, because we recognize Japan as the growing threat to us, and you have been playing Japan off against us for the past 20 years. And Theodore Roosevelt was stupid enough to go, and naive enough to go along with this dangerous policy. I mean, what could be worse for America than to have a British fleet concentrated with overwhelming power on the East Coast that in time of war could blockade or even shell the great cities of Boston and New York and Philadelphia into rubble with impunity from the sea, and destroy their shipyards. And at the same time, the Japanese, with the third largest navy in the world, can cross the Pacific with the protection and approval of the British and use British naval bases and do the same thing to Los Angeles and San Francisco. And that was thanks to Theodore Roosevelt and that strategic nightmare America was looking at for 20 years, from 1901 to 1921. But Warren Harding will not have this, and neither will Charles Evans Hughes. And the other thing they say is, we have a greater industrial capacity than you do. And you are in debt to us, we are in debt to nobody. Because we handled our affairs more sensibly during World War I than you did, right? Therefore, if you do not accept our terms for the Washington Naval Conference, there will be a naval arms race. We don't even care about the Japanese. It will just be the greatest arms race in human history for building battleships between the United and submarines between the United States of America and the British Empire. And we can outbuild you 3-1 or 5-1. And the full depth of the American concern on this for 100 years has almost till recently been completely overlooked. But the first-class American historian, and I will have to dig out his book for you and possibly send it out to you afterwards by email, but it only came out within the last 6 or 7 years. And a fine British popular columnist who's also a fine historian called Peter Hitchens, not Christopher Hitchens, his brother, Peter Hitchens. Now, Christopher Hitchens was a Marxist who became a neocon. His brother, Peter, who despised Christopher Hitchens all his life, the way only brothers can, is neither of those things. He's more like the British equivalent of a paleoconservative. And he brought this out too, because a discussion is held between Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes as soon as he takes office and the British ambassador to the United States. And the British are too embarrassed to publish it. And the Americans, since they get their own way and hold it over the British, but since they get their own way at the Washington Conference, they don't have to publish it. But it is an incredible revelation and an incredible humiliation to the British. And it is also, Matt, an extraordinary confirmation of the work that you and Cynthia and Anton, especially, and your colleagues have been doing so much in recent years on the depth of antipathy between the British imperial rulers of the Lloyd George government in the 1920s and the Harding administration. They hated and feared Harding and Hughes. They were terrified of them and they hated them because Hughes pulls no punches. I paraphrase a little here, but if you look it up, and even looking up Charles Evan Hughes, Washington Conference, naval race, should get you to the key point soon enough. What, in the recorded conversation between the two men, does the Secretary of State of the Harding administration say to Britain's ambassador to Washington? If it had not been for us, you would be speaking German now rather than English. He says this to him. That is the literal term. So do not lay down the law to us. We are laying down the law to you. These are going to be the new naval balances in the world. They are generous to you because they do not reflect the real change in power. They do not reflect the fact that manufacturing capability and financial strength to finance that type of capability, we can outbuild you and then we can sink the Royal Navy anytime we so choose to do so. Now, something else is happening at the same time. This is 1921, and it is this. Ireland has risen to fight for independence against the British Empire. And there are already 30 million people of Irish American background living in the United States of America. And Mayor Curley in Boston is the most Irish nationalist mayor and the most politically powerful national figure the Irish have produced on the national scene till John Kennedy himself. And in 1919 and 1920, the president of the Irish infant proclaimed republic, Eamon de Valera, still in his 30s, a man who would be shot and hanged by the British if they could lay their hands on him, comes to America and tours the great cities of Boston, of New York, of Chicago, of Philadelphia, of Detroit, all the great East Coast cities where not only is Irish population and ethnicity strong, but Irish cultural and political identity is still enormously strong. And the mayor of Chicago, Big Bill Thompson, a couple of years later, proclaims, and it is a vote winner for him, that if King George V of England ever dares to come to visit the city of Chicago, I will punch him on the nose. And he isn't bluffing. This is but the British needed America to save them in World War I. And they know this. Even the convoy system that saved Britain from starving in World War I was developed by Admiral Sims, a Franklin Roosevelt appointment in World War I. and successfully developed by the United States Navy with the support, initially tepid, in fact, of Franklin Roosevelt. But Winston Churchill in Britain opposes it, and the top admirals of the British Navy oppose it, and they only adopt the convoy system from America, and the Americans teach them how to do it, when they are being starved to death and there are only 30 days supply of food left in Britain because of the rate at which U-boats are sinking British merchant ships. And this is World War I, not even World War II yet. So the British know how vulnerable they were in World War I, how close they came to starvation and defeat, and how without US naval and army support in Europe, they would have lost everything. They would have lost everything. So what did they do at the Washington Conference? They accept the 5-5-3 formula. For every 5 battleships that the United States Navy deploys, the Royal Navy can only deploy just as many, 5, no more. And Japan is allowed to deploy 3 more. So Japan is allowed to build, according to the Washington Treaty, which Japan, as well as Britain and America, signs, 3/5 of the Navy surface fleet strength of Britain, 3/5 of America. But for the first time since the days of the Spanish Armada, the British have agreed to parity with another naval power. Up to that point, they had insisted in having a larger surface fleet and a more powerful surface fleet than their 2 most powerful enemies combined. And this had assured them global power against the Spanish in the 17th century, against the French kingdom in the 18th century, against the French Republic and Napoleon at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, against the Kaisers of Germany in the 19th and 20th century, and against Hitler, and even against the communists in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And it is no more. It does not end in 1945. They still have the illusion of world power in their colonies, so they're going their own way and losing control over them fast. But at the Washington Conference of 1921, Warren Harding, backing his Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, ends the British Empire of 340 years. And they do it so diplomatically and so smoothly that nobody in either country outside the highest levels of power notices. Now you might rightly say, isn't that enough of an impressive record to be going on with? And I've certainly spoken long enough. But in the next 10 minutes before I close down and hopefully give you a chance for questions, there are a couple of other minor unimportant achievements to add to what Warren Harding managed in the presidency that was even shorter than President John F. Kennedy's. Kennedy lasted until he was publicly assassinated, publicly executed in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. We all know that. But it was in August, I think August 7th, or certainly the first week of August in 1923. Let's see, 1 month of September to October, just under 3 months shorter presidency than President Kennedy. And everybody says truly about President Kennedy, what a tragedy it was he was cut down so soon. Think what he would have achieved if he had only been able to live longer. And this is true. But look at what Warren Harding achieved when he was cut down and was not able to live longer. Look at what he achieved. He also achieved the stabilization of the United States economy and built such a foundation for economic prosperity and growth that the American economy boomed for the rest of the 1920s and generated more wealth among more ordinary people at grassroots level than any other society in human history had ever imagined being capable of doing. The nearest thing forward was, according to the classical historian Gibbon, a large amount of relative prosperity and security for 200 years among even the peasantry of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was infinitely smaller in both population and size than the United States was in the 1920s. But that up through the British Empire, British Empire failed to replicate this, but the Roman Empire is cited by the greatest British classical historians as being more successful than Britain, more successful than China, more successful than Arab empires, more successful than anyone in maintaining large levels of prosperity for unprecedented numbers of people. The population is basically put at up to 70 million people up to the end of the 2nd century AD. That's the generally accepted to this day, which I also accept, projection for population economic levels in the Roman Empire. Right. Incidentally, it is a myth that lead poisoning led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. We should have a catastrophist discussion, if you'll tolerate it from me sometime, Matt, on that alone. It was the tidal waves and tsunamis and natural disasters of the early 3rd century AD that led to the rise of Christianity and the collapse of faith and paganism in the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire did not collapse because it was an empire, did not collapse because it was not a democracy. And it did not collapse because of lead poisoning or other crackpot environmental reasonings either. That's because the British scholars for hundreds of years are terrified of catastrophism and are uniformitarians to heart because they want to imagine their precious England lasting forever. That's what caused it all under the Victorians in the first place. But here we have Harding. He creates an economic condition which eventually is discredited because of the collapse of 1928-29. But let us remember the collapse of 1929 does not occur under his watch, it happens under Hoover. And Hoover does not follow Harding's policies for restoring the economy after there is an economic collapse. He does the opposite. Harding has faith in a free market and the workings of the free market. Harding says, do not pour lots of money from the government or lots of money that the government does not even have, but will print on speculation into the economy, and that will restore demand. Because that's what first Hoover tried, and FDR did too. And it didn't even work for FDR, though many other programs worked in a more limited way for FDR. What ultimately worked for FDR was something that was forced on him by his political enemies, the restoration of business confidence after he loses the midterm congressional elections of 1938. And I was astonished to discover this. And I was one of the first researchers, incredibly enough, to discover it back in my years in Oxford and afterwards. And I expanded on it in my book, Cycles of Change, My Political History of the United States. Economic recovery in the United States starts certainly when FDR takes over. But it rises up greatly from its catastrophic levels under Hoover. FDR does save America, no question about it whatsoever. But he isn't able to fully banish the Depression. It's still a blight over 20 to 25% of the people of the United States. And try as he might, experiment as he might, he can never clear that. The conventional wisdom is it was the influx of war economy demands from Britain and France before World War II and in the first year of World War II that restore Americans' economy to boom times. And I believe that myself, except when you actually look at the data that's available, and it's all there, levels of production in all the industries meticulously kept, both by private industry and by federal authorities by that point, and by state authorities. It's all there. You don't find that. And you don't find it in the fiscal balances and records either. What you find is financial recovery and then industrial recovery. And as a result, the agricultural economy has been stabilized first, thanks to the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Henry Wallace is one of the most underrated and unfairly despised people in American history. He saved American agriculture, and far from FDR and his people starving millions of people to death, they saved, of course, scores of millions of Americans from starving in the 1920s. And the key figure in this is Secretary of Agriculture and major Vice President Henry Wallace, a most underrated and admirable and visionary and brilliant, one of the greatest public servants the United States has ever had. And therefore he gets no credit for it, of course. But American industrial and financial recovery starts in 1938, 6 years after FDR has first been elected to the presidency. What FDR does not do is just step back and abandon the enormous fiscal tools that Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover have given him and let the economy work. But Harding, the small town businessman who understood at the grassroots level, from running a successful company himself at a small level, what it takes to preserve prosperity, what it takes to be able to afford to make a profit, to pay your own staff, how credit needs to flow from local banks into local business, and how therefore maintaining credit and health and balance of local banks, which FDR did understand very well, is essential to maintaining overall prosperity and growth. He understands this already in 1920-21, and he does something that Hoover does not do. It is Hoover, not FDR, but certainly not Harding, and not even Coolidge. It is Hoover who makes the Great Depression a catastrophe. He does many stupid, vile, idiotic things, but one thing above all else. He imposes wage and price controls as an absolute freeze on the United States economy. He will not let wages drop or prices drop in response to demand. In other words, it is Hoover who goes into history damning FDR as an evil socialist, who is the great socialist himself. It is he who scraps the fundamental structure of the free market system in the United States. And it doesn't work. Of course, history could have told him it didn't work. Richard Nixon tries the same thing with wage and price controls in the 1970s. It doesn't work for him either. Edward Heath, an appalling leader in Britain, tries the same solution in the 1970s in England, in the United Kingdom. It doesn't work for him either. The communists, of course, tried it in Russia and China. They starved millions to death of their own people whenever they tried it. It was a bad idea when the Emperor Diocletian tried it in Rome in the 3rd century AD, and it was a bad idea 1700 years later when Herbert Hoover tries it during the Great Depression, but it was not the fault or cause of Warren Harding. Now, why is Harding sneered at and hated? I touched on this at the beginning, and I want to go over this briefly. If people want me to focus on this in conversation afterwards, I'm very happy to do so. But as I say, well, first of all, he isn't a liberal. He's a free market conservative. Secondly, he isn't an East Coast, or for that matter, West Coast, elitist. He is not an intellectual. He does not appeal to the chattering classes. Henry James was a snob, the most revered writer who sets the style for American intellectuals, and especially for newspaper writers in the 1920s and 30s, was, and again, I forget his name on the spot, can someone come up for me, the sage of the Baltimore Sun. Very famous guy. Hang on. Let me, I have my phone handy.
That's H.L. Mencken.
Yes, oh, bless you. That's exactly what it is, H.L. Mencken. Now, again, I regard Mencken the way I regard Ernest Hemingway, with jovial contempt. The great Gore Vidal loathes Lincoln personally, actually adores Aaron Burr, but then he made it a lifetime out of being outrageous. But he's a wonderful corrective to all the pompous absurdities of American public intellectual life. And who else but Gore Vidal can you read and just laugh uncontrollably at every page? It's Gore Vidal who says about Ernest Hemingway, what other culture but America? Not Canada happily, but what other culture but America can produce someone like Ernest Hemingway and not be aware of the joke, right? Because Hemingway is such a joke, right? And I'd say the same thing about Mencken. Mencken is regarded as the great skeptic, the great genius. In fact, he hates Franklin Roosevelt to an extraordinarily hysterical degree all his lifetime. Needless to say, he also was withering contempt for Warren Harding. Harding is from a small town, and Mencken is from Baltimore. So, of course, he's infinitely superior to him, right? That's the way these people think. But Harding, there is one president Harding reveres, Woodrow Wilson, of course. And there are two leaders of his time who both show how absurd and contemptible democracy is. We settle for pathetic figures like Franklin Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt or McKinley, or worst of all, Warren Harding. And how can we do that when, if you look at the world, there are great towering figures of genius like Lenin and Stalin and Hitler? He writes this repeatedly, even through the 1940s. Mencken. But Mencken shapes a generation of American liberal intellectuals and conservative intellectuals. And the conservative intellectuals are they're intellectuals with pretension. They like to think they have more profound ideas. And Harding is an intellectual who is not an intellectual. He's a practical, decent, kind human being who was a conservative by temperament and experience. I had a friend who went through that experience. I love any chance I have to pay tribute to him, though I don't think any of you here would have close to ever heard of him. He was one of the great foreign correspondents of America for 40 years, but he was a breaking news correspondent for a war agency. He didn't write analyses. He didn't like doing commentaries. So he never got the intellectual, quote unquote, respect. Name of Rick Tompkins. Rick died about 5 or 6 years ago at the age of 75. And he was my right-hand man for a decade and a half in United Press International, and then he more than repaid the favor by bringing me into a very lucrative Central Asian energy news agency coverage system that he'd been asked to help set up. So I came in as a partner with him on that, and we had a great fun time running around Central Asia for several years together afterwards in our dotage. But Rick was extraordinarily brave and tough. He did 3 tours as a NEMBED with combat troops, going out on missions with them, 3 6-month periods in Iraq and a 4th one in Afghanistan when he was already in his 60s. On one occasion, he was blown up in a Bradley infantry vehicle by an IED, fancy name for an anti-personnel mine, of course. And he was so tough that he continued, although he was suffering from concussion, he spent another 4 months working through his whole tour of duty. His sons were grown and happily married. His wife had died some years before. He loved being in the field again. It made him feel young, he told me. So what did he have to lose? His short-term memory had gone. For 4 months, he filed stories every day. The next day had no recollection of the previous day at all, what he'd eaten, what he'd covered, what his stories were. Eventually, that memory came back too. But even without short-term memory, he worked for 4 months for 2 major national news outlets in the United States, and it was completely reliable, and nobody noticed any change in his coverage. This same guy is rejected for a job at the American Conservative magazine. He didn't particularly want it in the first place, but he's been recommended to them by several people, including me as a senior editor, right? So they ask him, and this applies to Warren Harding, and it's key to the secret of Warren Harding. Well, Mr. Tompkins, what were the conservative intellectual influences on you? What books did you read that made you a conservative? And Rick replied truthfully, I never had any. I read the Bible, he said, and I like to read the funny strips in the newspapers. I don't even read the sports, but I'm not into political philosophy. I'm a conservative because I feel that way, and it makes sense. He didn't get the job, but Warren Harding got the job, and we are all the better and the happier for it. Oh, he also brought Europe's best hope of peace in 20 years. He forced on Wall Street generous policies on loan repayment, and they didn't end the loans. That was too radical an idea for anyone at the time, but they didn't have to. But he encouraged low interest, generous, low payments to finance financial recovery as good investments in the major Western European nations. Now, this was sabotaged by enormous actions by the City of London. And again, I defer on this one to Matt, Cynthia, and Anton, and I think several others of you here, either in this seminar if we have time, or in others certainly. These are huge subjects by themselves. The financial undermining of prosperity and democracy in Central Europe between the two world wars. I can contribute to this, but I'm certainly not an expert or would claim to be on this subject. But as you rightly recognize in your face, Nathan, it's a huge and important subject and should not be neglected or ignored. But Harding's policies towards Europe actually compare favorably with US policies under Truman from 1945 to 1947, until the urgency of the crisis in Europe was recognized and the Marshall aid program, which Marshall didn't have the brains to do anything with, it's just stuck in his name because he was still a god before Congress. And Truman, who was politically cunning, though not rather positive in other respects, is desperate to get it through the Congress and will use any marketing trick he can on it. But even on the issue of restoring stability in Europe and rebuilding Germany in a stable democratic manner, Harding is ahead of his time. And had he been heeded to in his own time, that many of his policies, and again, I can easily speak to this if time permits, but it may be another subject either under me or under Matt. And I know, Matt, you know the subject extremely well, which is how so many of Harding's most important policies were deliberately scrapped immediately once Calvin Coolidge took office. Coolidge has the most exaggerated of reputations. And in fact, as I have mentioned before, Coolidge was physically and intellectually incapable of being president for 5 years. His beloved son had died from a tragic infection, which today would have been routine, but they didn't have antibiotics in those days, after he had won election in 1924. And he was then in deep depression through the entirety of his remaining full term as president. Slept 16 hours a day, did absolutely nothing. Conservatives now, no, nothing conservatives, today praise Coolidge as a philosophical example of masterly inaction, which everyone should follow, when it was Coolidge who made the catastrophe of 1929 unavoidable, when it could easily been avoided and would have been avoided had Harding still been alive. He also allowed 60,000, or was it 20,000, certainly scores of thousands of the Ku Klux Klan to march in the robes openly through the streets of Washington when he is president of the United States, saying there's no party has under the Constitution to prevent them doing it, which is a ridiculous lie in so many ways. But he was a coward and a hypocrite, but most of all, he was crippled by depression. I once told a noted eminent therapist friend of mine, degrees from Harvard, and this is not as a joke, she's really, really good. And I said, this is somebody I've been studying. I want your clinical assessment of it. You know, he sleeps 16 hours a day. He never speaks more than 3 or 4 words. He has a distant relationship with his wife and always did. He has 2 sons, one of whom he has passable routine relations with. The other was the apple of his eye, who he deeply loved, who died at the age of 16 from a foot infection after playing tennis barefoot, right? And he, ever since then, he goes out every night for dinner and never speaks more than 1 or 2 words. She said, my God, your friend is a suicide risk, Marty. You must tell him or get somebody in his family to do an intervention. He must be rushed into protected care immediately. Immediately. He could either die of grief or die of suicide at any moment. He is a prime risk figure. I say, well, he's safely dead now already, but you were talking about a man who served in this condition for 4 years as president of the United States of America. And that is Calvin Coolidge. Enough of Coolidge. We haven't even touched the very dubious circumstances of Harding's death, which there are people here who exactly know much more about than I do, and who I do not disagree with in the slightest. There's a subject, but if time permits again, I would be only too happy to share in going into or yield the floor to. But I hope I have made the case that this despised, forgotten, overlooked figure, and he has only been treated sympathetically, as far as I can see. I stand to be corrected. Anyone who can find it, tell me. But I have only found 2 sympathetic treatments of him in 100 years of American historiography. One of them is by a convicted Watergate felon, what was his name? John Dean, D-E-A-N. Remember, Nixon's lawyer? And he wrote in recent years, he wrote a small but very fine book. The one regret with the book is it's too short. 120, 150 pages. One would love Dean to still write a book 3 times that length. He's that good a writer. He's that fine and honest a researcher. And there's a beauty and elegance in his writing. And he's the only guy to really do him justice. And the other one, and only writes 4 pages or so on him. And that's again Paul Johnson in Modern Times. And he also goes back to the subject and the history of the American people. Paul Johnson, Modern Times, and History of the American People. But when it comes to Americans, no, conservatives sneer at him because he did have an illegitimate daughter in office. He did drink whiskey in the White House while it was banned not just by federal law, but by constitutional amendment, which has to be the most stupid and idiotic act even in the history of the legal and political systems of the United States, right? But so what? He was a good and admirable man. He restored the Republic for 100 years when it was literally falling apart. Oh, and also he released Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, from federal penitentiary after about 3 years, where Woodrow Wilson had condemned him to go, and which broke poor Debs's health. And after Debs was released, this Republican conservative president of the United States invites Debs to the White House for Christmas dinner because he said after all the suffering he'd had in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, at his advanced age in his late 50s and 60s, Debs, who had been a national political figure who had won 1 million votes in the 1912 presidential election, deserved at least a decent Christmas dinner. And when he was asked what he thought of Debs after he had him to the White House, this so-called cowardly, so-called nonentity, easygoing, ultra-conservative president from the Midwest replied, very fittingly from the New Testament, "I found no fault in him. I found no fault in him." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. That you gave us quite the feast of history, as you always do, which never quite just focuses on the simple topic, but always paints a much broader picture of the context, the psychology, the dynamics, and opens a lot of questions for the research as well, which I always love about your presentations. And I know everyone shares that same feeling. I've got a few questions, but I'm going to withhold for now, and I'm going to first give the floor to Stephen, who was the first to get in there, aching to ask a question.
I was. Thanks, Marty. Another brilliant lecture. Loved it. I can't wait for your magnificent opus book on all the American presidents. I'm sure it's coming out soon. I'd like to go back a little earlier in your lecture when you spoke about how Harding was brilliant in terms of how he won the presidential election against such a formidable opponent team, how he was able to recognize and get people to come to him, use small newspapers from across America, and particularly use the Hollywood stars back in the day, which was an innovation. And what you brought to my mind was the belief that some have that there's a Pentagon CIA nexus into the Hollywood entertainment thing. Did Harding sort of establish a template that nefarious factors or actors or entities later picked up on and developed? I mean, there was quite an innovation there in terms of his intuitive use of, it's almost the equivalent today of using social media and all the social influencers, to advance your political thing. So I just wonder if you had some thoughts about his innovations then and how it manifests now today.
Oh, I mean, I think, Stephen, you either I would love to give a joint session with you on that, or have you give a session. Or the point is, this is a wonderful subject to explore. I never conceptualized it in those terms, but several points. And as always, you make wonderful ones. First of all, I have already written and published the book you are so eagerly waiting for. It is not, I had to publish it myself after 140 American publishers turned it down, so it is only available on Kindle, but you should be able to get it through Amazon.com, all of you or any of you. It is called Cycles of Change. It is subtitled The Political History of the United States from Thomas Jefferson to Barack Obama. And there, since it came out in 2015, I could not quite yet include either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but you'll find that even at the end of it, I foreshadow both of them. And there is a reason I do not start with Washington or Adams, and there is a reason I end with Obama. And you can read the book on that. But the book, first of all, includes very detailed studies of the personality profiles and political strategies, not of every president, but of all the major ones, and especially of the 6 definitive presidents who reshaped conceptually American politics and political life. And I will mention them again here now because I can do that quickly. They are Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and then the interesting one, it's a toss-up between Theodore Roosevelt, who is the popular version for this, and unfortunately there's a reason he has enough impact to have so, but the man who it should have been is his predecessor again, William McKinley. And remember, Harding runs as McKinley, and he wins the greatest political victory in the history of American politics. And when Harding dies, the grieving for him, the national grief across America among black and white, poor and old alike, is as intense and widespread and overwhelming as it is going to be for Franklin Roosevelt 22 years later. And he's still only in his 50s when he dies. But that's the first key point you made, Steve. The second point is a huge one. No, America is too unsophisticated. Hollywood is too new. Harding also doesn't want to create this kind of empire and influence. It starts, there's no question when it starts with Franklin Roosevelt. And it isn't in Roosevelt's time a matter of the CIA manipulating Hollywood or the deep state. We get to that very quickly. We get to that in the 1940s. Once the armed forces are built up during World War II and are maintained after World War II, that is when the deep state Hollywood nexus starts. That is exactly when it starts, in the mid to late 1940s. Remember, during the war, Jimmy Stewart, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood in the 30s, volunteers to join the army. And General Hap Arnold, one of the most underrated political generals, as well as, and he's a superlative, outstanding military strategist too. Unlike the British, except for Hugh Dowding, the rest of them are catastrophes. But Arnold's a genius, and very underrated, because he does, for similar reasons to Harding, he's seen as non-intellectual, a guy who only focuses on his speciality, doesn't throw around that he's been reading Dostoevsky or Marx or any stuff like that all his life, doesn't have pretensions. But what he doesn't know, not just about aircraft and machinery and mechanics, personally taught to fly by Orville Wright. That's how far back he goes, right? Personally, they were close personal friends all their lives. All this kind of stuff is there with him. Extraordinary. But he already, under him, Jimmy Stewart, he's encouraging Jimmy Stewart to go back and make movies about the Air Force in Hollywood. Stewart enters the Air Force as a young idealistic lieutenant. By the end of the war, he's a brigadier general in the United States Air Force Reserve. He wants to give up his Hollywood career and serve full time in the Air Force. He loves it so much, he believes in it so much, he finds it satisfying. One of his movie stars, who actually plays the villain in with Jimmy Stewart in Lionel Barrymore, talks him out of it. He says, how is it you find more satisfaction in dropping bombs on human beings than in giving innocent pleasure to hundreds of millions of people through the movies? And Stewart says, I had never seen it that way before. I had never thought of it in those terms. But by the late 1940s and early 50s, he and, of course, John Wayne are already playing visionary generals in the Air Force, ready to nuke Russia to a smoldering halt in the name of world peace and democracy and free markets. And there is, in the 1940s already, a hagiographical movie made about General Billy Mitchell. the architect of Apropos, who was court-martial for it at the time, and who dies in his late 50s, and Gary Cooper, the purest, most idealistic, most revered star in Hollywood, is hauled out to play him, and does so very well. So you're right, it emerges early, very early. But it doesn't emerge that early. Franklin Roosevelt is an intermediate figure. Franklin Roosevelt does not want to build up military political power in America. He's afraid of it. He recognizes it's real. He openly talks about his chief of staff, Douglas MacArthur, as being one of the two most dangerous men in America. If anybody asks me later, I'll tell you who the other one was. But he's one of the two most dangerous men in America. And that governs his entire treatment of the Pacific War. And MacArthur, throughout World War II, US strategy in the Pacific is secondary to the danger that MacArthur may come home and run as a Republican in 1944 against President Roosevelt and split American national unity. So FDR's top priority in the Pacific is to keep MacArthur sweet and distracted. He knows there is no need to invade the Philippines. He knows we can just go through the island hopping chain, straight across the Pacific, the Nimitz strategy. But he has to keep MacArthur occupied, killing people the way he wants to kill people. And it is this same Franklin Roosevelt who does bring Hollywood star power to the White House. And in the 1930s and early 40s, a number of eminent Hollywood figures courageously support Franklin Roosevelt, and their careers are very seriously damaged as a result. And that includes some of the most improbable people: Jimmy Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, and Ronald Reagan. In the 1930s and 40s, they are all outspoken supporters of Franklin Roosevelt, and that they are all penalized heavily by the studio chiefs, who are all Jewish immigrants from Russia and all hate the New Deal and are ultra-conservative Republican reactionaries at the same time. And they also, incidentally, all refuse to make any movies highlighting the Jewish dilemmas in Europe. The first movie maker in Hollywood to dare to show the Holocaust in a mainstream American movie is not Jewish, of course. He is another friend of the president's who also suffered from being an outspoken supporter of President Roosevelt, Orson Welles. Orson Welles. And as Matt and Cynthia have repeatedly documented all the way through into the 1960s, courageous Hollywood movie makers like Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick are repeatedly frozen out by the studio system, because they are trying to alert to the dangers of political extremist takeover and military coups in the United States, or to the danger of people provoking nuclear war from our side. And President Kennedy, when he was alive, supported them. He recognized the dangers too. So your question is a very apposite and relevant one. You've opened an enormous issue here that has never been properly looked at, ever. It does not start with President Harding. It doesn't start with President Franklin Roosevelt either, for that matter. But already the power of the public media, and especially the power of Hollywood, is so great that nobody dares to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Marty.
Marilyn Langlois, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Oh, fascinating talk. I learned so much from listening to you. And I got to tell you, one of the reasons why I was so happy to hear this talk is that back in the 1950s, I attended from about age 5 to 11 Warren G. Harding Elementary School in the small town of El Cerrito, California, on the east side of the San Francisco Bay, where I was born and raised. And at the time, of course, we knew that Harding had been US president, but nothing. He was like, in my consciousness, he was some insignificant president for 2 years, and that was it. I don't recall him ever being badmouthed or demonized, but just insignificant. So I'm really, really happy to learn about how significant he actually was, and for all the reasons you mentioned. So thank you again. My question is couple things. If you could just address a little bit about what evidence there is, if any, of foul play that played a role in his untimely death. And then just another point I wanted to clarify. You talked about how he supported an anti-lynching law, which is very, very admirable, one of the very admirable things he did, even though it couldn't be implemented before he died. Did you say something about FDR or not? Because I have heard others say that FDR would not support an anti-lynching law, and I'm a little puzzled about that.
You are correct about FDR. My answers are multiple fold. First of all, no one is perfect. It's as simple as that. That's the first point. And FDR did more for the living standards of ordinary Black Americans than anyone had since Harding. And that was a lot. And the great movement into the Democratic Party started under him. But it was remarkable, even that it went as far as it did, because even in FDR's time, and this is why he did not do more, half the Democratic Party was from the South and were deeply in favor of all Jim Crow legislation. Mm. And they were all insistent in allowing a free hand for lynching as well. This anti-Black racism institutionalized in America was far worse in the 20th century than it was after the Civil War in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. President Grant, as I have said in the previous lecture, and I demonstrated it, smashed the Klan, used military power to do so, was highly effective. Even the great gun battles of the Midwest were part of the same battle. Wyatt Earp and his family and friends in Tombstone were federal law enforcement officers who also were involved with Republican banks and big business and most of all the railroads, which they passionately supported. And the cowboy gang, who they fought, which was really the trans-state criminal organization, we would call it today, it was much bigger and more powerful. And Jesse James was a major charismatic leader in it. This was part of the continued Confederate rebellion and war on Black people and on full civil rights for Black African Americans that continued for a decade and a half until it was lost after the Civil War. It was won under won under Ulysses Grant. Those gains were somewhat, though not totally, retained under the very milk and water leadership of Rutherford B. Hayes, and it was abandoned after 1881. But the famous showdown at the OK Corral was a showdown between Wyatt Earp's federal law enforcement officers, who were champions of federal law, and most of whom had impeccable records in the Civil War in the Union Army, against former Confederates. And it is Confederates who like Jesse James, who are responsible for it. They demonize the railroads and Wells Fargo and the big financial institutions. And believe me, there's good reason to do so too. You know, this is one of those where it's black and white, very much on the same side in the North. But having said that, they're not fighting Northern business and Northern railroads because they're oppressing the people, but because they're bringing hope to Black people. That's why Jesse James and his friends are doing it. And the transformation of Jesse James and Billy the Kid and Southern outlaws who are fighting the Union, who are fighting the United States, who are not just fighting a big bad cattle baron or this or that. The whitewashing of them only starts in the 1920s and 1930s. And actually, Hollywood is weaponized politically this way long before, I think you're ahead of me here, Stephen, again, long before it is weaponized by the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is established in the 1940s. It wastes no time getting Hollywood on its side, all the way. But white racists have Hollywood on their side from 1916 onwards. The Death of a Nation. The movie, the first long, epic, historical movie ever made. And the treatment of Black human beings in that movie has to be seen, to be believed. It is abominable. It is identical to Nazi propaganda films demonizing Jewish people as depraved monsters in the 1930s. It is equally horrific and disgusting and unconscionable and that bad. And that is the death of a nation in 1916, which Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States at the time, and you know what's coming next, Jerry, called the most wonderful, classic, masterful movie ever made. It will last forever, and it is unbearably true. Where it shows black people acting as worse than gorillas and apes and weeping white golden-haired virgins, of course, on the desks of congressional state legislatures across the South. Did anything like that ever happen in real life? No, of course not. It was innocent young black women and girls and even children who were endlessly raped and murdered. It wasn't the other way around. It's Freudian projection again at work. But this is weaponized by Hollywood, in Hollywood, as early as 1916, and 20 years later, in a more genteel way, of course. That's how you have to deconstruct Gone with the Wind. It again is prettifying the same racist, sexist, utterly disgusting, vile system. But I'm sorry, did I answer the question, or is there anything else I need to come back on? Because I know I went off my tangent.
That's fine. And I presume you're using the title Death of a Nation sarcastically for the film Birth of a Nation.
Yes, no, it was even better than that. Thank you for the correction, Marilyn. I wasn't even being, I'm at my best sarcasm when I don't even realize it. I just got it mixed up. Thank you for the correction.
That was a good Freudian slip. And yeah, no, the only other thing.
Right. It's a very Freudian slip, yes.
Other than that, just briefly, or if anyone else can, just because we've seen, good presidents murdered in office, any evidence as to foul play in Harding's untimely death?
The answer is direct evidence, I believe, no, but I stand to be corrected on that. Matt knows much more about this than I do, so does Stephen. There are other people here, I'm sure, at the same thing is true of. Anton is another superb expert on this. There are some very dubious factors, and in two respects. Oh, there's one factor I've come across that I've not been seen in a debate on this before, and maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if you've come across this one, Matt. On the night that the president died, and his death took everyone by surprise, and it could have been a heart attack because he was in a weak condition, and he was deeply upset, not because he was a dishonest man, but because he was a deeply honest and honorable man who had discovered that his own Secretary of the Navy, and worse yet, his own Attorney General, Harry Doherty, had stolen the strategic oil reserve of the United States of America. It was the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, Harding had nothing to do with this whatsoever. In fact, his actions to clean it up immediately were a model that put virtually every president since 1945 to shame by comparison. He was a totally honorable man, but he was deeply upset by this. It was weighing him down. On one occasion, shortly before he leaves the White House, eyewitnesses credibly report him taking the Attorney General of the United States, Doherty, holding him up. And Doherty was a slim but proud and dignified guy, as the worst crooks often are. And Harding was easygoing and genial, but a big burr of a man, well built. And Harding picks Doherty off his feet, holds him by his collar, shakes him, and says to him, "You dirty son of a bitch, how dare you do this to the United States of America?" And other things as well. So the scandal is real. The possibility of a heart attack is real. But the possibility of, they had just passed through Canada. Now, Harding has to be strategic target number one for the British Empire, because he has just inflicted a greater defeat on the British Empire than Napoleon, the Spanish Armada, and the entire German armed forces in World War I had ever managed to do. He had taken 340 years of British naval supremacy away from Britain and imposed the 1921 Washington Naval Treaty on him. And the City of London bankers were hollering at him because the New York bankers were imposing terms on London over war loans that London didn't want to pay back. And London was screaming about this for relief. And I stand to be corrected, but am I right in saying they got that relief they were looking after, and they got much more favorable terms to invest in tyranny in Central Europe after Harding and Hughes had been removed from the scene? It looks from your face. I am correct. Am I not in saying that, Matt?
Coolidge was much more favorable to these policies. Yes.
Yes. Exactly. And you must remember that's a key factor that also applies for the Kennedy assassination. Now, the evidence that JFK was a central figure in the assassination before it is overwhelming. He boasted of this to his mistress a week before the assassination, that he wouldn't have to pretend to be sweet to those damn fucking Kennedy boys anymore. He was open about this. He was a very crude figure and very embarrassing for the deep state because he couldn't keep his big fat mouth shut, even though he was very corrupt and did all their work.
Sorry, Marty, I just slipped off. Who is this figure that you just spoke boasted?
Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Now, it is known in the case of Johnson, there was no secret that while Kennedy was alive, Johnson, while he supported, to his credit, great policies like civil rights and being responsible towards the Soviet Union, there was a whole range of policies like the war on organized crime and the mafia, and a whole other range of issues that he fought Kennedy like blazes over and hated Kennedy. And he knew Kennedy was going to drop him as a vice presidential candidate in 1964. He knew this for a fact. So the motivation for Johnson eagerly, as with J. Edgar Hoover, eagerly supporting the assassination, it's overwhelming. That's credible. But the point about Coolidge is not generally known. And remember, all this happened before Coolidge's son died and before Coolidge plunged into his terminal depression, which he never recovered from till the day he died in 1932. And I would suggest here, just as a suggestion, but again, I don't believe anyone has made the suggestion before, and it is this, that if Coolidge had any intimation that he was to become president and Harding was to be removed from the scene, he may, and since like so many of these people at that time, he really was a Bible fundamentalist of the simplest and most hypocritical kind, it is extremely feasible that he felt profound guilt that his son's death was divine, as it may have been divine judgment on him for passively going along and benefiting from. Because he had wanted the presidency, he admits this, and he had gloried in it. And he has a very revealing phrase on his reaction after his own son dies. And remember, this is only a couple of months after President Harding dies. Coolidge says, "For me, all the joy and triumph and glory of the presidency vanished on that moment." Now, that's hugely revealing. Because even today, presidents are supposed to, they all crave it, of course. They all crave wanting to be president, even if it's just the illusion of glory, like the Roman emperors. But they're supposed not to feel that way, and they know enough as politicians to pretend not to feel that way in public. I mean, Johnson in public was a model of apparent restraint and grief and dignity. And he was dancing jigs in the White House, you know, before Kennedy's shattered brain was buried and stolen. All of this, but he knew enough to pretend to be dignified in public. Coolidge, revealingly, in 1923, does not have that. Harry Truman has a different reaction entirely. It's very, again, a revealing one. Harry Truman loved being a senator, loved it, did not want to be vice president, because when he was a mean little son of a bitch, he was no fool. He was no fool. And he knew he was being saddled in to inherit the job on behalf of the state from a dying man, and he didn't want the job. He didn't want the job. And both privately and publicly, his reactions after FDR's death ring true. He knew it was coming. And it's not, I don't believe FDR was poisoned, though Stalin did, but then Stalin believes everybody is poisoned. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. The miracle is that FDR, who was a dying man already coming back from Tehran in October 1943, lasted as long as he did. But in the case of Harding, apart from Matt and Anton and Cynthia and your colleagues, nobody else I have seen has done any serious research on this or work on this. And it cries out to be done because the circumstantial circumstances are very strong. When does it happen? All his symptoms are very consistent with poisoning. They're very consistent with gradual arsenic poisoning. He'd been fed lots of oysters on the presidential train coming back from Alaska down the West Coast. And remember, even the visit to Alaska, think of the assassination in Dallas. And look up my articles in Canadian Patriot Review, and if you can still find them in the strategic studies outlet in Moscow on the assassination of of the man who President Harding most reveres, President McKinley, in 1901. President McKinley is not assassinated in the White House, where there is where his personal security is actually quite good, and where he's surrounded by loving and loyal staff and officers. He is a world fair has been set up in the most ridiculous place imaginable, Buffalo. Now, Cincinnati, St. Louis, San Francisco are all Chicago are very legitimate sites for world fairs. They're major, growing, booming cities in the American heartland at the end of the 19th century, even if they're later shut down by the bankers in New York or the international liberals, which they are eventually. You know, they still have booming economies at the time. They're the cutting edge. They're very legitimate places to hold world's fairs. But even then, Buffalo was a backwoods hole in the middle of nowhere. Didn't even have a passable football team in those days, right? So you put the cart before the horse. See who set up the World's Fair in Buffalo, because then the president has to go there, because Buffalo has something else at the end of the 19th century. It has the largest, best organized, most violent, murderous, and ruthless anarchist cell in America, led by a man called an immigrant from Germany, not Jewish, it's hasten to add, because everybody's accused of being Jewish in these situations anyway. His name is Johann Most, M-O-S-T. And he is a close corroborator and trusted lieutenant of Prince Peter Kropotkin, the international head of the anarchist movement from 1876 onwards, who is the mastermind of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, with his legs blown off by specially designed shrapnel grenades in April 1881. And Kropotkin is then given safe haven for the rest of his life in London by the British authorities and the British deep state, lives in great comfort to the day he dies, eventually goes back as Lenin's honored guest and becomes Deputy Minister of Education in his 70s in the Bolshevik government in Moscow, in Petersburg, and is a supporter of Lenin till his death, absolutely. And of course, the key figure in the McKinley assassination, who actually in both you could read this online. It's published in Canadian Patriot Review. You should also find it online. I've had it published in other outlets. But the parallels between the assassination of President McKinley and the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881, and who they benefited, and even the very structure of the assassinations is parallel to each other. Individual Polish loser immigrant nutcases, in both cases, actually throw the bomb or fire the bullet. But in both cases, they have been set up by improbable, stupid, passionate, violent young women radicals who have been mistresses personally of Peter Kropotkin. And Kropotkin, who remember lives in Moscow, had visited the United States with impunity many times over the previous decades. And not just New York or Chicago or Boston. And in Boston, he was a guest at the Colonial Club in Harvard, which was run by close personal friends of Theodore Roosevelt. The connections here are much more easily established and documented than I ever dreamed. And I have not done serious years-long research on this. All my research on this has been done in recent months from suburban America, online. And even then, it's all this stuff is there. Heaven knows what else is there, and especially actually in the archives. Who knows what else is there? But in the case of Harding, the British have much more reason to want him out of the way than they had with the three previous American presidents who they had certainly eliminated in 1865 and 1881 and in 1901. He had destroyed the naval power of the British Empire. He had forced them to terminate their alliance with Japan, thereby putting the Eastern British Empire across half the world, across the whole Indochina region, at risk. And sure enough, Churchill would bungle it and lose all of it within the next 20 years anyway. He did. They did lose that empire. And as Matt points out, in addition to that, they were demanding rigorous terms of repayment from the City of London for their enormously beneficial wartime loans, which Churchill again was at the heart of. And it helped make Bernard Baruch an even wealthier man than John D. Rockefeller. Yet another subject, let me just add here, that is worth some of you first-rate people looking at for the first time. How much did they both benefit from it? The World War I relationship between British Minister of Munitions, Winston Churchill, 1917 to 18, and the biggest financier of industrial growth in the United States. J.P. Morgan was dead. John D. Rockefeller was old and retired. So Andrew Carnegie had died. Who was this key individual? Bernard Baruch. And in 1929, as late as that, when Winston Churchill gambles all his personal fortune on Wall Street and is totally wiped out and is penniless, it is Bernard Baruch who buys up all the stocks and repays him just as a personal gift so that he doesn't lose a penny. One might also add that when Franklin Roosevelt is dying in not 45, but 1944, he goes for a 2-month vacation on a South Carolina estate where nobody can see he is a dying man. It is Bernard Baruch's estate. He is a guest of Bernard Baruch for 2 months during 1944. Now, there is no hint that Baruch wanted him dead. Baruch actually probably wanted him alive. Baruch had benefited enormously from FDR, since FDR had also helped make Baruch one of the richest human beings who ever lived, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. These people can be multifaceted. Baruch was a deep personal friend of FDR, loved him, revered him, supported him, and simultaneously loved Churchill even more because he made more money from Churchill than he ever made from FDR. So there's a multifaceted aspect to many of these stories. But you find these people like Baruch or Kropotkin or Churchill popping up all over the place. Now, 1923, as I say, the government in London is in chaos. They have 4 different governments in the space of a year and a half. They have a Liberal government, a Conservative government, a Labour government, and then another Conservative government again. So there is political upheaval in London, which basically allows the deep state to operate with even less political oversight than it was used to having. And this should be borne in mind too. The key figure in approving this was most likely the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, a real hardline imperialist of the old order. And of course, as Matt and Cynthia have documented so often, this is a time when our friends of the Round Table, the heirs of Cecil Rhodes, are in their period of maximum influence and power in London. But in America, they're being stymied. They haven't taken over the Democratic establishment yet. They took the Republican establishment for granted as long as Theodore Roosevelt was there. One other figure we should look at in this that has never been looked at, and in a sympathetic manner, and that is Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, who is so hostile to the British. When I first read the account of his discussion that I gave before, I was shocked because I still thought Britain, America, great allies, cousins, friends, what have you. But now I look at it from a different perspective. Remember, this man was plugged into the New York elite establishment in good ways, not just bad ways, arguably, but certainly in good ways, for at least 20 years. He had been a a very powerful and effective and respected Republican governor of New York State for 4 years. He had been the Republican presidential candidate against Woodrow Wilson. He might have legitimately won the 1916 race. It was the results of California that came in very late, and it was run by a Democratic state governor with certainly national Democratic sympathies at the time. It is California that puts Woodrow Wilson over the top in 1916. So even the results and outcome in California specifically of the 1916 presidential race should be scrutinized carefully in skeptical ways. I'm not saying that they're false, but they should at least be scrutinized and assessed carefully, right? But in any case, Charles Evans Hughes is hugely hostile to the British. And he's only shut down and squeezed out as Secretary of State because his president, who he is loyal to and who thinks the world of him, dies in office. So there are question marks at the very minimum hanging there. And I leave one last point on this. And I'm sorry to go on so long on it. And if anyone has anything substantive to add, please do so. But it is this. Several people had toured through Alaska with President Harding. One of them was his eventual successor, Herbert Hoover. In San Francisco, there was living at the time, it was as near as he got to a natural home in America, the head of the United States Army in World War I, John J. Pershing, who deeply opposed Harding's enlightened, moderate, liberal Republican policies. He opposed Harding. Less than 10 years later, as we know, as General Smedley Butler points out, there was actually serious talk of a military coup to topple President Franklin Roosevelt from the White House. On the night of that President Harding suddenly dies in his San Francisco hotel room, Pershing is dining across the city with Herbert Hoover. Now, that could, of course, be a coincidence. It could be a coincidence, just as it could be a coincidence that Richard Nixon and many of the plumbers happened to be in Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963. And as Matt and I have discussed, there is tendacious and hotly debated, but certainly available on the video, alleged evidence that future President George Herbert Walker Bush was walking in the streets below the book depository right before the assassination. There is video, and it's unquestionably Bush. The question is, where was the video shot? And more especially, is the timestamp, which claims to be there, but you can easily fake timestamp, so who knows? But as I say, when it comes to the issue of Harding, do I have hard evidence? No, I do not. But is the overall concept feasible politically and strategically? Yes, it certainly is. And one last point. The president had been fed a lot of oysters on his trains on the West Coast and had been complaining of tummy disorders for a long time. Oysters are a perfect recipe to hide the taste of arsenic if it is given to people in gradual doses to mask the fact of poisoning and make it appear a gradual death from illness over long periods of time. Similar technique may have been used to kill the Vice President of the United States, Vice President Hobart, in 1899 to clear the way at the next convention for Teddy Roosevelt to become vice presidential candidate instead. You'll find that in my published writings too.
Yeah. Well, definitely the approach you're taking when lacking an actual smoking gun is to just look at, well, what enemies was he making, on whose shoes was he stepping on, and what global dynamics would have been challenged if he had been able to carry out the policies he was committed to, and who would have lost. So you can get enough motive, definitely. And I think one thing that's strange is that both he and Franklin Roosevelt have the common characteristic of having wives who somehow, for whatever reason, and I don't believe the wives killed either man, but chose to not allow an autopsy to happen to either body. Because in the case of Franklin Roosevelt as well, which is where you and I have a bit of a difference, I find it weird that there's never been an autopsy. So there's a lot of conjecture. And we know his personal assistant, Edwin Watson, also died as soon as he came back from Yalta, and immediately died his best friend, closest assistant general, Edwin Watson, Franklin Roosevelt. And
Yes.
then no autopsy. So Warren Harding as well, no autopsy. What are we going to say, right?
Yes, no, exactly. Now, I'll add a few points that go in both directions on both guys. In FDR's case, there is no, without question, there was a deliberate cover-up, and they were desperate not to have an autopsy. But there is another reason for this that increased scholarship in recent years has brought out. And that is FDR physically was not capable of being president and should not have gone on being president. I have another book here if I can find it. Oh, I probably don't. But I'll tell you the title. It is called His Last Battle by Joseph Lelyfeld, Lelyfeld. Actually, give me a moment. I will be right back with the cover of the book.
I don't buy it.
Well, I can imagine a wife feeling convinced that there's obvious reason for the death. It's so obvious in your mourning, and why bother with an autopsy if it's just only up to the wife herself? But who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Here is the book, guys.
James Lelyfeld?
Yes. Now, this is very conventional history. It doesn't challenge anyone head on. But what he does document, and other people document it too, is the depths of Roosevelt's sickness. And the key points on this, first of all, had any autopsy been held and the results been known, the Democrats would have been out of office for at least 25 or 30 years, because any autopsy would have documented that Franklin Roosevelt was a dying man for at least a year before he died. In fact, he is given a cardiac examination by Dr. Bruin, Howard Bruin, Bruenn, in October 1943. And Dr. Bruin is, all of this is now public record for many years, but Dr. Bruin is shocked at what he discovers. He believes the president's Kerr, Under Admiral McIntyre of the Navy, was shockingly incompetent, that FDR is dying. He stabilizes the president's condition. He puts him on digitalis, which in those days was basically the only treatment, and not a very good one, but the only treatment in extremis. You must remember there was no such thing as open heart surgery, let alone pacemakers or heart replacements in those days. Heart surgery is incredibly modern. It is only invented by a black doctor in Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. This is a very famous story now, in the 1950s, and the doctor, who is not even a formally registered doctor, he's always listed just as a medical assistant, though by the time he dies, he is rightly head of all heart surgery, surgical operations at Johns Hopkins, but he invents the whole discipline of open heart surgery, and he even has to invent and personally design all the surgical tools that are needed for it, because nobody has conceptualized them before. And he does all this while having to enter the hospital through a side door because he is black. And although this is north of the Mason-Dixon line, somewhere, no, actually, I think south of the Mason-Dixon line, but still a state forced into the Union. They were still enforcing segregation into the 1950s. It's an extraordinary story. And none of even the most basic open heart surgery is available to Franklin Roosevelt when he is a dying man. It has not been developed yet. But if any autopsy had been done, it would certainly have confirmed and documented that Franklin Roosevelt should never have continued as President of the United States from October 1943 onwards, because he was already a dying man. The most extraordinary measures are taken to protect him from his wife, because his blood pressure shoots up 50 points every time she is lecturing him on supposed things he ought to be doing and isn't doing. To protect him from Winston Churchill, who is a national menace, who wants to send hundreds of thousands of more American boys to be needlessly slaughtered in Italy, in the Balkans, in Rhode Island, in Sumatra, by invading Greenland. I'm not making any of these things up. These are all things Churchill, not just once, but repeatedly and for hours at a time, tries to impose on FDR every time they meet from 1943 into late 1944. In the end, Churchill is kept for years at a time from Franklin Roosevelt to protect what's left of the president's health. So there are other reasons for this, but there would have been an enormous scandal if it was ever documented after the war, while the Democrats were still in office under any Democratic president, that the great sainted Franklin Roosevelt was dying and artificially kept alive and only capable of working for 1 to 2 hours a day, even in the lightest circumstances. And because he had done so much before, because America was so powerful and rich, because the system was so politically tight, I mean, this even fits into segregation issues. The American economy was run from the beginning of 1942 to the end of the war by James Burns, Byrnes. Now, Burns is a figure who is as enormous and eminent in American history and overlooked as Charles Evans Hughes is. And I think he's overlooked for a very deserving reason, because he's a bastard. But where he was and what he did is astonishing. He had been United States Senator from South Carolina, first point. Then he had sat on the Supreme Court as a Democrat, second point. Then he had left the Supreme Court to serve as assistant president to Franklin Roosevelt in overall charge of the wartime economy from 1942 through 1945 for 3.5 years. And he was a brilliant success in that role. Then he was FDR's favorite candidate to replace him, to replace Henry Wallace as vice president in 1944. But there was a problem. Two problems, actually. Burns was opposed to labor unions, and he was also a white racist who championed segregation in his own state. So he would have lost the Democrats huge numbers of black voters and working class white voters. Right? Those were the problems with Burns. But after the war, Harry Truman thinks so much of Burns, he makes him Secretary of State, and Harry Burns helps start the Cold War. He is not in favor of cooperation with Russia, right? He helped start the Cold War. Then Truman drops him, and he goes back to South Carolina, and he becomes governor of South Carolina. And then after he's governor of South Carolina, he represents the South Carolina in an obscure legal case. Now, look at this man's history and background. He has been one of the most powerful men in America for 25 years, right? Every position except president. And he's held more power than many presidents in some of his positions. And now he represents the state of South Carolina yet again. He has been senator, Supreme Court justice, governor. And now he represents them in a court case before the Supreme Court where he served with many of the sitting justices. And he loses that court case. What is the court case and who does he lose it to? It is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. It is, and the obscure young lawyer who can hardly afford to pay for the laundry bills of his own family because he's so hardworking and idealist, is Thurgood Marshall, future Justice of the United States Supreme Court himself. And as a young black lawyer in the heart of segregation, Thurgood Marshall outwits and outlegalizes and outprecedents and outargues one of the most powerful men in American history so effectively that even his Southern political allies, who are still immensely strong in Washington, cannot overcompensate and make up for it. And here is an example, in a way, the opposite of Charles Evans Hughes. Hughes is a figure who destroys the British Empire, who is unknown in America, who has done virtually every major thing in American history. Nobody's ever heard of him. Here is a man now forgotten, Burns, who is revered in levels far in exceed of that Truman and Eisenhower were at the time, and parallelly FDR himself for decades. But on one crucial issue, he is morally and disgustingly and incontrovertibly wrong, and he is rightly defeated. And the man who defeats him goes on. Marshall is so eminent for so long that at the end of his life, people are accusing him, you've been too powerful and too wealthy and too acclaimed for too long. You're out of touch with ordinary people. Maybe there was some truth to that. I don't think so myself, but you know, the argument is, but for a man who into his 40s is raising his family on a shoestring, in obscurity. When, as a black lawyer in business America, he could have been making hundreds of millions if he'd sold out to the system. It is a very striking story and a rare story where the good guy wins.
Warren, wait a minute. How long do you have, Marty? Do you have a cutoff here, or?
I may be cut off by family members. This has been known before, but right now it's not closing time yet. Fire on, Matt.
Okay, so we have two questions. We got Warren, who has a very interesting question on War Plan Red that I'd love to hear your answer on, and we have Adam as well. And I think we'll have to wrap it up after Adam, probably. But Warren, go for it. I mean, Monty.
Yeah, Mark. Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. Greetings from Baja, California. We're on the tail end of a hurricane, so thankfully I got on today. But I'm always struck by the radical shifts in American history where,
Yes.
Britain is recognized as being our arch nemesis, and then there's special relationship, and then an arch nemesis again, and special relationship again. And I was struck by your comments on the Washington Naval Conference, 1921. I'm wondering if that might have been the origins of what became known as War Plan Red and War Plan Orange in the 1930s. I know this is pretty much written out of American history, but I wasn't sure as to the origins of it. Was this the Secretary of State or Harding, or what's the history on this, and how was that introduced in that recognition of Britain and Japan as being our two top potential enemies? Thank you.
Well, again, the issues of Britain and Japan are different issues, and the issues change over the years. I am not an expert on this subject, and you ultimately need to read several different sources on it because there are different conflicting views at different times. I mean, we still see it to this day, and that is administrations come in and go out, and they had different views on the matter. And it's not just a question of Democrats will be liberal and Republicans will be conservative. The meaning of liberal and Democrats changes from generation to generation and from administration to administration. But there are a number of general things that can be said. First, the British were strongly pro-Japanese up to the 1920s. And Churchill was until 1940. Churchill never dreamed Japan could be an enemy. He is consistent on this, even during the months when America and his own admiralty are warning him about Japanese war plans in 1941. We're defenseless in the Far East. The Germans are stretching us to the limit. We managed to hold the Germans, but you're not. Why are you sending all these weapons to the Middle East to stop a tiny little German force under Rommel in the Middle East? Actually, there were good reasons for that, both strategic in the war and in terms of winning the war and surviving, and in terms of imperial interest. There were good reasons, but they just didn't have enough wealth and resources to go around to defend the Far East as well. They build the Singapore naval, they keep the Japanese. I'll deal with first Britain and then America. Britain is easier. Britain, the Japanese treaty is a godsend to Britain in 1901. Because it enables Britain to bring the entire battle fleet of the Royal Navy to home waters, to concentrate on it against Germany, to contain the new German Navy. And they are loyal to the Japanese alliance. And the Japanese are loyal to the British alliance and want to maintain it in 1921. The English only give up the alliance because Charles Evans Hughes and President Harding insist on them doing so. First point. From the American perspective, views on Japan have changed. They've all, Theodore Roosevelt, of course, is the heart of all darkness on this. It is already fashionable in the 1890s to see Japan as a possible future enemy. But this only really starts to emerge after 1905. Now, lots of different interpretations emerge on Teddy Roosevelt's role in ending the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. It's like looking at a Rorschach test, and I'm open to different interpretations and arguments from anyone here, because I have strong ones of my own, but not that strong that I believe they're certain. I'm not sure that they're right. At the time, the settlement is hugely debated. Russians claim Teddy Roosevelt has intervened on the side of Japan just when they're about to win the war and imposed a much too merciless peace on Russia. In Japan, they believe Roosevelt is a racist who has done the opposite. right? My view is this. Roosevelt makes the same mistake in 1905 that Churchill made in the 1920s, late 30s and 40s. He underestimates the Japanese people and Japanese capabilities. Roosevelt is a racist. He admires the Japanese as an imperial conquering people that is enslaving China. Roosevelt approves of this because it's the way he feels the Latin American peoples need to be enslaved and put in the right place by the superior wasp culture of the East Coast United States establishment. This is where I see it coming from. Roosevelt cuts a very dark deal with the Meiji Emperor in Japan. It is this: you give us a free hand to crush the Philippines mercilessly, and we give you a free hand to take over Korea, and we will not disapprove. And there the matter rests. But during World War I, Japan takes advantage of its alliance with Britain to expand its power in the Pacific. Divisions on this are very interesting. The British and French governments are happy with this. They encourage Japan. So does Italy. Australia and New Zealand are scared stiff. They are white, racist, dominant societies at that time. And they are also very prosperous and low population societies. And the only power that is capable of threatening them in half the world, unless the Royal Navy comes to save them, is Japan. And Japan is coming up fast. And people in California, especially right-wing reactionaries, want a war with Japan, and they're scared stiff too. They want a war with Japan. And that's the way it divides, right? And now Teddy Roosevelt dies, and he's succeeded still by another Republican, but by a very different kind of Republican. Roosevelt never paid any attention to Senator easygoing, kindly, loves to see children play junior senator from Ohio while he's still alive. He despises Warren Harding as not being a real man, right? Not sending lots of idiot innocent boys to be slaughtered on the Western Front or charging up San Juan Hill for some ridiculous, obscene fantasy of glory, right? That's Teddy Roosevelt. It is not Warren Harding. But now Harding is president, and a man who despised FDR and everything he stands for, Charles Evans Hughes, is Secretary of State of the United States. And they are determined, they are under no illusions about Britain or many of the dark games Britain played to pull America into World War I. They recognize that very clearly indeed. And being former governor of New York State, Charles Evans Hughes is in the perfect position to recognize how relatively weak London's all-imperial position has suddenly become vis-a-vis relative to the United States. And people in the rising powerful Republican Party in California are scared stiff of Japan. And Admiral Mahan himself has warned that a war with Japan is possible. So what is the great strategic American fear in the early 1920s? It is having to fight Japan and Britain simultaneously. And simultaneously in the establishment, there is, you are right, it is in the 1920s that the United States Navy and Marines both start wargaming and serious planning for a Pacific island hopping war to Japan. It is when Plan Orange starts. The origins of Plan Orange are already there a decade before this. Let us remember in the 1920s, General Billy Mitchell is already warning it is not the British or the Germans, it is the Japanese or the Soviets. It is the Japanese who can attack us at Pearl Harbor with air power and sink our battleships at point blank range while they are safely in harbor. The Japanese haven't come up with that idea yet. You know when the Japanese get that idea? When their plan is developed? In the beginning of 1941, less than a year before the actual attack. Why is it so late? Because in December 1940, the Royal Navy sends a dozen biplanes, World War I technology. You all know what biplanes are, right? What they look like, right? They even had open cockpits. They could only fly at 100 miles an hour. When there was a strong wind against them, it looked like they were helicopters. They couldn't make any forward progress at all. They were a joke. But in the war at sea, in the Atlantic, both the Japanese and American navies would have shot them down immediately. But the Germans weren't that developed. The Italians had good weapons, but were hopeless with them. And the British were brilliant at making do with what they had. So it's these tiny little biplanes that cripple and doom the Bismarck, then regarded as the strongest battleship in the world, in April 1941. But before that, December 1940, 12, only 12, right? Count them on the fingers of two hands, and two more if you're a mutate with double teeth and red hair like the giants were supposed to be, right? 12, you can count them on 12 fingers. 12 biplanes attack 6 Japanese battleships at harbor in Taranto. They completely destroy 3 of them and they cripple the other 3. The entire Italian naval supremacy in the Mediterranean Sea, over 2,000 miles, is wiped out by 12 biplanes at one stroke. Now, this wasn't supposed to happen because torpedoes are supposed to only run at deep levels, and Taranto Harbor was supposed to be too shallow for torpedoes. So what did the British do? They took off the metal fins from the torpedoes and they put wooden steering stabilizing fins on them instead, which meant that the torpedoes didn't sink to the bottom of the harbor. They could still operate in 20 or 30 feet of water. They didn't need 50 to 100 feet. So you could launch them in the harbor and they could sink the battleships even when they were in the protection of their own harbor. And the Italians already have diplomatic relations with Japan at the time, and the Japanese naval attaché in Rome travels to Taranto to see what sank the Japanese battleships. And he's a very able officer, and he reports this back to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who's the head of the combined fleet in Tokyo. And that's where the Japanese get the idea that they can put wooden fins on their torpedoes, just as the British did. After all, they've been they're revering the Royal Navy for the last 50 or 60 years. And once again, even when Britain is on the other side of the war, they learn from the Royal Navy. And they sink the American Pacific Fleet at harbor. And Churchill never thought it would happen. He knew, I've discussed this before, and may again, it's worth a separate treatment. Churchill knew the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming. He had hard intelligence. It was coming at Pearl Harbor. He knew when it was coming. He sat on the information. He refused to send it on to President Franklin Roosevelt. 2,500 Americans were killed, and thousands more, including my late father-in-law, were injured because they were in Pearl Harbor at the time serving the armed services when that attack came. Did Churchill want the Pacific Fleet sunk? No. He was a racist. He was an idiot. He was convinced battleships could not be sunk by aircraft. He was convinced the Japanese were a pathetic little people. He admired them for conquering and enslaving China. Good imperialist stock. But they weren't European. They had bad teeth. They were small. They were short-sighted, so they couldn't fly modern planes. He really thought all of this. He's on record as saying it repeatedly. He refuses to approve building the Singapore naval base and fortress in the 1920s because he says it will never be needed. Who is going to attack us? Only Japan, you say. That will never happen. As prime minister in 1940, he scraps plans to send any spare aircraft and tanks to defend Malaya. The idea that Japan is capable of going all the way from Japan to attack us in Malaya is, of course, ridiculous. This is the Great War genius. So he wants the attack on Pearl Harbor to come. He never dreams it will be a success. He's a racist, so he never dreams it will be a success. But back again, the roots of Orange are already there in the 1920s. And there was a very fine book called, yet another one I'll cite to you, Engineers of Victory by Paul Kennedy. Wonderful Anglo-American historian. He's been in jail for the last 30 years. Neocons hate him because he cycles the rise and fall of empires in economic cycles. And he's always been right. So, of course, they hate him because he warned what the consequences of their policies for America would be. But Paul Kennedy wrote about 20 years ago a wonderful book, respectfully reviewed but widely ignored, called Engineers of Victory. And he has an entire chapter on the technology and tactics developed by the United States Marine Corps in the 1920s for island hopping. for all those successful maritime campaigns that we took for granted. But whenever the British tried a maritime campaign in World War I, they totally failed. And whenever they tried a maritime campaign without the United States in World War II, it was a total fiasco as late as 1943. The British were incapable of carrying out amphibious invasions anywhere unless we built the landing craft for them, and we had our generals and admirals basically organizing the whole thing, and we supplied the specialized technology which the United States Marine Corps was designing for war against Japan from the 1920s onwards. So again, Stephen, a wonderful question. There's a lot in the answers to it.
All right, last question coming in from, are you still there, Adam? I don't, do I see Adam? There he is. Hey, Adam.
Oh, good.
Still here. First of all, I want to thank you for giving this presentation too. In school, I was always taught Harding was kind of something of an amiable dunce, and a successful president. And I had reached this, not to flatter myself, but I've reached this conclusion kind of independently on my own reading, and I was extremely happy to see someone who's done thorough research reach that same conclusion. But my question is, for a president who served only 2.5 years, Harding had an enormous influence on the Supreme Court. He appointed 4 of the 9 justices, and Taft as Chief Justice, Edward Sanford, and then interestingly, Pierce Butler, who was Catholic, and George Sutherland, who was Mormon. And I think not coincidentally, there were a series of important religious liberty decisions.
Yes.
Came out on the side of religious liberty throughout the 20s. And I was wondering, what was Harding's influence on that and on the court more generally?
I think this is a subject you should speak on to this group more than me. You already know much more about it. Really, yes, absolutely. And also, Matt will happily facilitate this between us. And actually, I'd be very happy to with everyone here. But please get my email from him. And again, an invitation, please, to everyone in this group. I would love to discuss any or many of these issues or other ones with all or any of you. But Adam, in this case, I'm very selfishly involved because I will be learning more from you than you will be from me. I would be most interested in the books you would recommend on this because it sounds like different ones from my books. And as I say, I have been struck and embarrassed by the paucity of favorable, balanced, informed assessment and comment and scholarship on President Harding when it's all so easily available. It's all so easily available. So I would be most interested in, your recommendations on this.
Well, I can. My reading is based on the decisions themselves. Pierce.
Then you must write them up at the very least for Canadian Patriot Review.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Well, I can just tell you for everyone who's listening now, there's one. It's Pierce versus the Society of Sisters of the Sacred Heart. It was the state of Oregon tried to require all children to go to public schools only. They had banned religious education, essentially. And it was challenged, and the court, this was 1925 or 26, fell heavily in favor of favoring allowing religious education, and they struck down the law. And there were a couple others along those lines, too. That just kind of gives an example. And I think all of Harding's justices came down on the side of religious liberty in that case.
Thank you. That is hugely helpful because I know when the great clash of the Supreme Court came against FDR, most of the justices, Sutherland was the only, I think, genuine Republican appointed one who was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse who so opposed the New Deal. But I understand correctly, the 3 greatest opponents of the New Deal on the court, when the great clashes came from 1933 to 1937, were not Republican appointees by Harding or anyone else at all. They were all appointees by Woodrow Wilson. Including his own attorney general, Wilson's own attorney general.
Yeah, James.
They were much more reactionary and hostile to the New Deal than Hughes himself was. And Hughes, of course, had been Harding's trusted right-hand man in government.
Yeah, I would be. Yeah, if it's okay with Matt, I would be happy to write up a little article on that.
That would be amazing. I love how that worked out. Great. Cool.
I'm back to my old job being a talent scout again.
No, this is, you can't turn it off, and you shouldn't. This is wonderful. It's a gift that keeps on giving. So Marty, thank you very much as always. And God, there's so much to think about. And months ago, about 2 months ago, you pitched an idea to me. You pitched a class or a lecture proposition that I'm hungry for. I don't know if you're still up for it, but when you wrote that you'd like to talk about the 110 plus year plot by the British and the French to enslave Mexico and the battles of Lincoln and his allies against that. I would love that class to happen. Could that be the next one?
With pleasure.
Yeah.
And again, in a way, it's very easy. I have researched it. I've actually had chunks of it in previous seminars. But you know the old joke about blind men feeling an elephant, and one feels the tail and one feels the trunk. Yeah. And one feels the big, powerful leg or the body of the elephant. And that's what this is, because over the last 5 years, I've been giving lectures on this. And even before that, I've been giving strategic lectures on this to audiences from the Department of the Environment, the Air Force, the Armed Forces, over US-Mexico relations over the past 20 years. And it's been an aspect here and it's an aspect there. And yet, I suddenly realize, sometimes when you just sit back, things in your mind come together and you realize these things are not disjointed. You did this at one point in your life, you did this at another point. A boyfriend or girlfriend says this, a teacher says that, you see something on TV here. And sometimes decades later, clunk, my God, it's the elephant. It's all part of the same picture. So I'd love to, absolutely. It starts in the 1820s. It is already outrageous in the 1830s. It is the driving force for the 45 to 48 war against Mexico, which Ulysses Grant said was the most unjust war that he believed had been recorded in human history. And he felt so strongly and so shamefully about it, he was ready to sacrifice his entire military career on principle over the war. And it is at the center of the murder, which has never been acknowledged as a murder of assassination of the president of Mexico in the 1870s. There is a 35-year rule over Mexico, which is an oppression as cruel as Hitler's or Stalin's in the Western Hemisphere, which is admired as being an example of liberal enlightenment, democracy, and free trade, and all these other good things in all the British and American and French media at that time, from 1876 to 1911. And it explains admirable Mexican policies, which successive Mexican policies never got any of the credit they richly deserve for raising the standard of living of their own people and raising a destitute population of 10 million after the collapse of society in the 1910s, over the next 70, 80 years to a thriving population of 110 million. And it also puts the appalling drug wars, which we are so deeply involved in context to this day. So it's highly relevant in terms of border security and survival and dignity for both nations today. But the story is never looked at as a whole, and it is never taught as a whole. And I can tell you, fascinatingly, in Washington, no attention is ever paid to it. If I may, just very briefly before I go, the Irish in incessant passion for our stories, right? After I covered the collapse of communism for 6 years and the disintegration of the Soviet Union at the Washington Times, I got been awarded my first 2 Pulitzer Prize nominations. And my career, my career is like mountains. It's up and it's down, it's steep and it's slow, like everyone else's. And I was riding at the height of Everest there, as far as it went. And I was told by my top editors, what would you like to do next, Martin? Choose your own beat, right? And I was too clever by far. I said, I want to do Latin America and I want to do Mexico. First, because everyone is ignoring it. Secondly, because the culture is so wonderful. Now, of course, I didn't say it, but I love the cuisine, right? The culture is so wonderful. But most of all, reason 4, nobody's paying any attention to it. Be all mine, right? I outsmarted myself, not for the first or last time. There was so little interest. There was no cover-up. There was just so much ignorance and lack of interest in all of Mexico, in all of Latin America, all the way down from the Rio Grande to the Straits of Magellan, that I could get no stories on page one or above the fold. And the image I was getting even in my own newspaper was Marty's lost it. He's gone into a tailspin. And a highly sympathetic, brilliant foreign editor came on board, happily still very much with us, Mark Lerner, went to the powers that be and said, you know, I know everybody's saying Marty's not delivering. You know, one of the reasons he was given the job of foreign editor was, can you get, you know, Marty back on form? And Mark was brilliant. He saw the problem. He saw the reason for the problem. He said, would you like to be State Department correspondent? Well, I didn't particularly, but I knew I was going nowhere fast in the beat I myself had chosen. So I said, fine. And I flourished there for the next 7 years. The point was, when it came to covering Russia and China and Israel and the Palestinians and Northern Ireland and both sides in my native Northern Ireland, right? Oh, there was endless fascination for this, right? But here is this enormous nation of 110 million people on whose goodwill and civilized nature and cooperation, and ready far too often to look the wrong way, the United States has benefited from endlessly for 200 years, and knowledge of Mexico and her achievements is totally unknown, and respect for them. And all they care about is Northern Ireland, who's fighting who in my native Belfast, or what bombs have gone off in a craft fracker in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Ramallah. Well, I mean, people there have a good reason to be caused about that. But should this, or, you know, we have to defend, as George, the younger idiot Bush said, we have to defend the national rights of Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, even if it means world war with Russia, right? Duh. Are these really sensible priorities? Are they sane? Are they sane? So this blindness of Washington, of senators from states like California, Arizona, Florida, what's really going on in the world on their own doorstep. If you looked at Ukraine in terms of Mexico or Canada, the attitude would be different. Suppose there were either Ukrainian Canadian terrorists were killing thousands of people every year in Montana or Kingdom of States, or suppose the Mexican government was seen to be behind evil terrorist attacks across the border from Mexico. Would we take military action against it? Well, the Russians did in Ukraine. But when the Russians did in Ukraine, we said we ignored the provocation, and the invasion was terrible and bad enough. But we ignored the context, we ignored the provocation, and we refused to take action to prevent the terrible war breaking out. And now almost 500,000 Ukrainian boys are dead, and that for a war that did not have to be fought and should be stopped immediately and is monstrous. And yet we're in a similar state of ignorance ourselves about our own cross relations. We seem to be a bit better when it comes to dealing with you guys up north. When it comes to dealing with Mexico, the ignorance of the history and the interactions and what Mexico has had to suffer from is enormous. As I say, there was a genocide in Mexico. It was supported not by the United States, but directly by the two main liberal democratic imperial powers in the world at the time, Britain and France, and nobody in America knows about it. So the answer is yes.
I'm going to use this as a promo for that lecture when it happens in a few weeks. This is great. Thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Why is it I'm never remotely as good in promoting myself as you are in promoting me?
That's why we work together. We dance together. This is good. We all have assets.
Amen.
All right. So thank you, everybody. This is a great Sunday, wonderfully mind-expanding Sunday, the best kind of Sundays. Real, you know, this is sacred stuff.
Thanks,
so thank you, Marty, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Marty. Hola.
Hold on.
Thank you, folks. Hang on, let me just put here.